Hey folks, gather around. I know I'm just an old guy spinning yarns, but hit that like button and subscribe before we get started. Let's dive into today's tale. But first, a quick disclaimer, the stories I tell are just for fun. They're speculative, and I don't have any hard evidence to back them up. So, take it all with a grain of salt, alright? Now, or was I? Ah, yes. Ever since I moved into my quiet little apartment building, there's always been something a bit off about my neighbor, Mr. Davies. It wasn't anything obvious, like hoarding junk or spying on people. Actually, he was quite polite and well-spoken. But something about him just didn't add up. For starters, he always seemed way too prepared. I'd often spot him loading his car with these huge boxes labeled emergency rations or hauling military-style backpacks into his apartment. He'd give me a nod if he caught me looking, but he never explained what it was all about. Once, I even joked about him prepping for the apocalypse, and he just smirked and said, "You'd be surprised what you learn to prepare for." Creepy, right? Then there were the noises. Late at night, I hear these faint whirring sounds coming through the wall we shared. Rhythmic and mechanical, like some kind of machine running in a factory. I figured he was just a hobbyist, maybe an inventor or something. But he never mentioned it, and I never asked. But what really caught my attention was how little he seemed to need. He didn't seem to eat much, his trash bins were always practically empty, and I never saw him carrying groceries. He worked odd hours too, coming and going at strange times, always wearing the same faded gray hoodie and jeans. And he never looked tired. If anything, he seemed too alert, like someone running on an endless supply of energy drinks. But without the jitters. One day, I decided to strike up a conversation. I'd just gotten home from work and saw him sitting on the steps outside his door, staring at the horizon like he was expecting something to appear. "Nice evening, huh?" I said casually, trying to be neighborly. He glanced at me, and for a moment his expression was unreadable. Then he gave a small nod. "It is," he said. "Clear skies are good for thinking." "Thinking about what?" I asked, leaning against the railing. He hesitated, like he was deciding whether or not to say more. Finally, he leaned back, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "You ever wonder how much of what we see is real?" he asked. I frowned. "What do you mean?" He looked me dead in the eye. "I mean, how much of us is real? How much of who we are is still human?" I laughed nervously. "That's pretty deep for a Tuesday night." He didn't laugh. Instead, he stood up, brushing imaginary dust off his jeans. "If I told you something," he said slowly, "would you promise not to think I'm crazy?" "Ah, sure," I said, though his tone made me uneasy. "I was part of a military project," he said, "a long time ago. They called it Project Regenerate." I blinked. "Like a science experiment?" He nodded. "They were working on nanotechnology. Microscopic machines that could repair tissue, eliminate fatigue, and even sustain a body without food or water. The idea was to create soldiers who could survive anything. That sounds intense, I said, trying to keep my voice light. But I mean, that's classified stuff, right? How do you? Because I was one of them, he interrupted. I wasn't supposed to survive the trial phase. None of us were. I stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or call someone. He must have noticed my expression because he shook his head and gave a bitter chuckle. You think I'm making it up? That's fine. I would too, if I were you. Okay, I said cautiously. So what happened? Why aren't you still, part of it? Because something went wrong, he said. The nanobots didn't just heal us. They started adapting, making their own decisions. Some of the test subjects changed. They stopped acting like themselves. Changed how? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled up his sleeve, revealing a faint, almost geometric scar on his forearm. This is where they injected them, he said. At first, it was like a miracle. Cuts healed in seconds, hunger and thirst disappeared. But then, his voice trailed off, and for the first time, I saw something that looked like fear in his eyes. Then what? I pressed, despite myself. They started controlling us, he said quietly. The bots, I mean. They learned how to override our brains, make us do things we didn't want to do. That's when I ran. You ran? I repeated. From the military? How do you even? I didn't say it was easy, he said, but I had to. I couldn't stay there and let them turn me into something else. I opened my mouth to respond, but he cut me off with a raised hand. Don't worry, he said, his voice suddenly light again. It's not your problem. Just stay out of my apartment if anything ever happens to me, okay? Before I could say anything else, he turned and went inside, leaving me standing there with more questions than answers. Over the next few weeks, I tried to forget about our conversation, convincing myself that Mr. Davies was just a guy with an overactive imagination. But then one day, he vanished. No note, no warning, just gone. That was when the real nightmare began. Mr. Davies' disappearance wasn't immediately noticeable. He lived a quiet life, so a few days of silence didn't feel out of the ordinary. I assumed he'd gone on one of his mysterious outings, maybe to the wilderness or wherever people who hoard survival gear go to unwind. But as the days stretched into a week, unease crept in. His car hadn't moved. The blinds in his windows, usually slightly parted, were now tightly shut, and packages piled up at his doorstep untouched. It was like the man had evaporated. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. On the 8th day, the property manager knocked on his door, clipboard in hand. I watched from my window, pretending to clean a coffee mug. After a minute of no response, the manager sighed, scribbled something, and left. That was when I decided to check for myself. It wasn't something I'd normally do. I'm not the kind of person who pokes around in other people's business. But Mr. Davies had left me with that cryptic warning, stay out of my apartment if anything happens to me. Why would someone say that unless they expected something to happen? Against my better judgment, I waited until nightfall, grabbed my spare flashlight and approached his apartment. The door was locked, of course. I'd expected that. What I didn't expect was how easy it would be to get in. A quick nudge on the door frame with my shoulder, and it swung open. Either he hadn't locked it properly, or the lock was faulty. For a guy so paranoid about security, it was surprising. Inside, the air was stale, like the place had been sealed for weeks. The blinds blocked out all light, and the only sound was the faint hum of an old fridge in the corner. His apartment was eerily neat, not spotless, but there were no signs of a struggle or a hasty departure. It was as if he'd just stepped out for a moment and never returned. I started in the living room. His couch was threadbare but clean, with a stack of books on the armrest. Most of them were technical manuals, stuff about engineering, biology, and even quantum mechanics. On the coffee table, there was a journal, its cover plain and unassuming. I flipped it open, half expecting to find grocery lists or scribbled reminders. But the pages were filled with diagrams and notes written in precise, tiny handwriting. The words didn't make much sense to me. Something about autonomous repair systems and neural integration thresholds. It sounded like the kind of jargon you'd hear in a sci-fi movie. One phrase stuck out, though, written in bold letters across a page: the hosts are no longer in control. My stomach tightened. What did that mean? Hosts? Control? I closed the journal and moved to the kitchen, trying to shake off the growing unease. The fridge was almost empty, except for a few bottles of water and a single Tupperware container with what looked like a neatly packed meal. There were no dishes in the sink, no signs of recent use. His pantry, on the other hand, was stocked with canned goods and vacuum-sealed packs, enough to last for months. It was like he'd been preparing for an extended lockdown. As I moved deeper into the apartment, I noticed something strange about the walls. In the dim light of my flashlight, I could see faint scratches around the outlets and vents, like someone had pried them open recently. I crouched down to inspect one of the vents, and sure enough, the screws were loose. Inside, there was something shiny, like a piece of machinery, but I couldn't reach it. Finally, I made my way to his bedroom. Unlike the rest of the apartment, it was messy, papers scattered across the desk, the bed unmade, and a laptop sitting in the center of it all. The screen was dark, but when I pressed the power button, it flickered to life, asking for a password. I sighed, staring at the screen. There was no way I could guess the password. I was about to shut it down when I noticed a sticky note stuck to the side of the monitor. It read, "Project Regenerate Override Protocols." Below it was a series of numbers and letters. I typed it in, half expecting it not to work. But the laptop unlocked immediately. The desktop was bare except for a single folder labeled Logs. I opened it, and a list of files appeared, each one marked with a date. The most recent file was from the day he disappeared. I clicked on it. The screen filled with text, detailed logs of experiments, trials, and what looked like personal observations. Mr. Davies' words stared back at me. The nanobots are evolving. They're no longer following their programming. If they breach containment, there will be no way to stop them. I've isolated myself, but it may already be too late. I leaned back, my heart pounding. What was I supposed to do with this information? Mr. Davies wasn't just paranoid, he was living in fear of something he couldn't escape. That's when I noticed the second to last line of his entry. If I disappear, it means they've taken over. Don't trust anyone. Don't let them in. I quickly shut the laptop and stood up, my mind racing with possibilities. Taken over? By what? Was he talking about the nanobots? Could something like that even happen? The weight of what I'd found began to sink in, but I didn't have time to process it. In the silence of the apartment, I thought I heard a faint whirring sound, just like the ones I used to hear through the walls. I froze, my flashlight beam trembling as I turned toward the vent. The faint whirring sound didn't stop. It was coming from the vent, just like before, but now it was louder, more deliberate, like something moving inside. My flashlight beam stayed fixed on the vent as I debated whether to leave or investigate further. A sane person would have walked out and called it a night, but curiosity, or maybe stubbornness, kept me rooted in place. I crouched down and leaned closer, shining the light directly into the vent. The shiny object I'd noticed earlier was still there, but now I could see it more clearly. It wasn't just a random piece of machinery. It looked like some kind of miniature drone, its surface sleek and metallic, with tiny blinking lights. It wasn't moving, but the sound was definitely coming from somewhere near it. I wanted to grab it, to take a closer look, but I had no tools to open the vent. Instead, I made a mental note to return later with a screwdriver and stood up, deciding I'd seen enough for one night. As I moved to leave the bedroom, my eyes fell on a framed photograph sitting on Mr. Davies' cluttered desk. It was the only personal item I'd noticed in the entire apartment. The photo showed a younger Mr. Davies standing next to a group of men and women in military uniforms. They looked like they were celebrating something, smiling and holding drinks, but there was a strange tension in their expressions, like they knew something no one else did. The back of the frame had a small slip of paper taped to it. Curious, I peeled it off and unfolded it. Written in Mr. Davies' meticulous handwriting was a single sentence: Project Regenerate isn't about saving lives, it's about controlling them. I stared at the words, my mind spinning. What did he mean by controlling them? The logs on his laptop hinted at the nanobots going rogue, but this suggested something more deliberate, something planned. Was the project's true purpose to create obedient soldiers, people who could be controlled down to their very thoughts? I slipped the note into my pocket and decided it was time to leave. The air in the apartment felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves were holding secrets too big to contain. I turned off my flashlight and made my way back to the front door, stepping carefully to avoid making any noise. As I reached for the doorknob, something caught my eye, a faint red light blinking on the corner of the ceiling. I hadn't noticed it when I first came in, but now it was impossible to miss. It looked like a tiny camera, the kind used for home security systems. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. Had someone been watching me this whole time? But no, the apartment had been abandoned for over a week. If Mr. Davies had set up the camera, it was likely connected to a local storage device, not a live feed. Still, the idea of being recorded made me uneasy. I quickly left the apartment, locking the door behind me as best as I could. The hallway felt unusually quiet as I made my way back to my own place. Once inside, I locked my door, closed the blinds, and sat down at my kitchen table, pulling out the slip of paper I'd taken from the photo frame. The words stared back at me, and for the first time, I felt the weight of what I'd stumbled into. This wasn't just some conspiracy theory or the ramblings of a paranoid man. Mr. Davies had been trying to warn me, or anyone who would listen, about something far bigger than himself. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd found. I spent hours researching nanotechnology and military experiments, trying to piece together the fragments of information Mr. Davies had left behind. Most of what I found was speculative, articles about DARPA's research, rumors of classified projects, but none of it came close to the level of detail in his logs. The whirring sound I heard in his apartment kept haunting me, too. It wasn't just a random noise, it was deliberate, purposeful. I began to wonder if the drone-like device in the vent was more than just a piece of equipment. Was it monitoring something? Or worse, was it still active? Finally, I decided to go back. This time, I brought tools, a screwdriver, gloves, and a small storage box to hold anything I might find. I waited until late at night, when the building was quiet, and slipped back into Mr. Davies' apartment. The vent was exactly as I'd left it, and within minutes I'd removed the screws and pulled it open. The shiny device was heavier than it looked, its surface smooth and cool to the touch. Tiny symbols were etched along its edges, symbols I didn't recognize. It didn't seem to have any obvious buttons or switches, but as I turned it over, a faint blue light blinked to life on its underside. I nearly dropped it in surprise. The light pulsed softly, like a heartbeat, and the whirring sound started again, softer this time, but still distinct. I placed the device in the storage box and quickly sealed it shut, hoping to muffle the noise. As I reattached the vent cover, something occurred to me. If this device was still active, then maybe Mr. Davies wasn't paranoid after all. Maybe he was right to isolate himself. Maybe the nanobots, or whatever they were, had found a way to keep working even after he disappeared. But if that was true, then where was Mr. Davies now? I left the apartment, the storage box tucked securely under my arm. Back in my own place, I set the box on my desk and stared at it, unsure of what to do next. The device inside felt like a Pandora's box, something that could either unlock answers or unleash even more questions. One thing was clear, whatever Project Regenerate had been, it wasn't over. The storage box sat on my desk for 3 days, untouched. I couldn't bring myself to open it. Every time I glanced at it, I thought about the faint blue light and the rhythmic whirring sound. It wasn't fear holding me back, it was more like I didn't want to face whatever truth it might reveal. Once I opened that box and started investigating, there would be no turning back. On the 4th day, curiosity got the better of me. I cleared my desk, made sure my door was locked, and carefully unlatched the box. The device inside looked just as it had before, sleek, metallic, and impossibly futuristic. The blue light pulsed faintly, like it was alive. I spent a while examining it without touching it. There were no obvious markings except for the strange symbols etched along the edges. They looked almost mathematical, like equations or algorithms, but none of it made sense to me. I tried to remind myself that this was just a piece of technology, not some living organism, but the longer I stared at it, the more I began to doubt that. Finally, I decided to take a closer look. I put on a pair of gloves. I wasn't about to take any chances, and carefully lifted the device out of the box. It was heavier than it looked, and as I turned it over in my hands, I noticed a small panel on the underside. It didn't have any screws or hinges, but when I pressed it lightly, it clicked open, revealing a cluster of tiny wires and what looked like a memory card. I pulled the card out and set it aside. The moment it was removed, the device stopped humming, and the blue light blinked off. For a second, I wondered if I'd broken it, but then I realized that was probably its default state, inactive until it was powered by the card. The memory card itself was no ordinary storage device. It was smaller than any card I'd ever seen, with a faint holographic shimmer on its surface. I had no idea how to access whatever data it held, but I knew someone who might. There was a guy I went to college with, Jason, who worked in cybersecurity. We weren't exactly close, but we kept in touch occasionally. If anyone could figure out what was on this card, it was him. I called him that afternoon and told him I needed help with an old storage device I'd found. I didn't mention where it came from or what it might contain, just that I couldn't access it with any of my equipment. Jason agreed to take a look, but only if I brought it to his office. I wasn't thrilled about leaving the safety of my apartment, but I didn't have much choice. I packed the card and the device back into the storage box, grabbed my keys, and headed out. Jason's office was located in one of those nondescript office parks that could have been anything from a tech startup to an insurance agency. When I arrived, he was waiting for me in the lobby, wearing his usual grin and a faded hoodie that looked like it hadn't been washed in a week. "Long time no see," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "So what's this mystery gadget you've got?" I handed him the box, and he raised an eyebrow as he opened it. "Oh, where'd you get this?" "It looks like something out of a science fiction movie." "Just something I came across," I said, keeping my voice casual. "Think you can figure out what's on the card?" Jason shrugged. "Shouldn't be a problem. Let's head to my lab." His lab turned out to be a cluttered office filled with monitors, cables, and half-assembled computer parts. He cleared a space on his desk and plugged the memory card into a reader connected to his main computer. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the screen lit up with lines of code scrolling rapidly across it. Jason leaned forward, his expression shifting from casual curiosity to focused intensity. This isn't normal," he muttered. "What do you mean?" I asked, stepping closer. "This card isn't just storing data, it's running something. A program, maybe, but it's encrypted to a level I've never seen before. Whoever made this didn't want anyone accessing it." He typed furiously, navigating through layers of encryption and firewalls. After a few minutes, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Okay, I managed to decrypt part of it. There are logs, tons of them. Most of it's technical jargon, but..." He clicked on a file, and a series of documents filled the screen. The words were similar to the ones I'd seen in Mr. Davies' journal: autonomous repair systems, neural integration, adaptive control. But there was something new here, something that sent a chill down my spine. Phase 3, network integration. What's Phase 3? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jason scrolled through the file, his brow furrowed. It looks like they were planning to link the nanobots to a central network. Once connected, they'd be able to communicate with each other, share data, and even... He stopped, staring at the screen. Even what? I pressed. Even override individual hosts, he said, his voice flat. The network would act as a single entity, controlling every host simultaneously. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just about creating self-healing soldiers or eliminating the need for food and water. This was about control on a massive scale, turning people into puppets for whoever controlled the network. Jason turned to me, his face serious. Where did you get this? I told you. I just found it, I said, trying to sound convincing. Well, whoever this belonged to was into some seriously dangerous stuff, he said. And if this project is still active... He trailed off, leaving the thought unfinished. I left Jason's office that evening with the memory card and the device packed safely away, but my mind was anything but safe. Phase 3-inch wasn't just an experiment, it was a blueprint for something far worse than I could have imagined. And Mr. Davies had been right in the middle of it. The question was, how far had it gone? It was just one of those nights, you know? The kind where Netflix is a total snooze fest, social media is just endless, boring scrolling, and sleep is miles away. So, I ended up doing what I sometimes do when I'm restless. I fired up the Tor browser. Yeah, the dark web. Before you freak out, it's not as sinister as people make it out to be. Mostly dead links, random forums, and sketchy online marketplaces. But sometimes, you stumble upon this weird little pocket of oddities. Conspiracy theories, obscure PDFs, and chat rooms where people whisper secrets they probably shouldn't even know. That's where I found it. A post on some forum called Truth Hunter X. The title was total clickbait. CERN found the source code of the universe. They're debugging reality. I almost closed the page right there. It sounded totally nuts, like one of those Area 51 is a gateway to Mars kind of posts. But this was different. It wasn't just a wall of text rant. It was clean, methodical, almost like a professional wrote it. This user, GlitchSeeker37, claimed that CERN, you know, the big science lab in Europe with the particle accelerator, had developed a program called Reality OS. An AI, supposedly, that could access the source code of existence itself. According to the post, CERN had been running debugging protocols to fix anomalies, basically glitches in reality caused by errors in the code. These glitches, the post explained, were things like people misremembering details, events being out of sync, or objects appearing where they shouldn't. Here's where it got weird. The debugging wasn't just fixing objects or events. The post alleged that entire people were being erased. If CERN determined someone was an anomaly, they'd just disappear. Not just from the present, but from history. No social media, no photos, no memories from loved ones. Like they'd never existed. I scrolled down, expecting to see a donate to my cause link or ads for tinfoil ads. Instead, there were links to videos. Dark web links always feel sketchy, but I was curious and wide awake, so I clicked. The first video looked like security footage from some random city street. Maybe Paris, judging by the cafe awning. A woman in a red coat walked past a bus stop. Nothing strange until she glitched. Her image froze for a split second, then pixelated, like bad CGI in a low-budget movie. When the frame stabilized, she was gone. And the people around her didn't even react. The second video was even creepier. It showed a family in a restaurant, looked like a McDonald's or something. A man at the table suddenly flickered. His wife and kids kept eating like nothing happened. Then, poof. The man's seat was empty, like he'd never been there. But here's the real kicker. His reflection lingered for a split second in the shiny surface of a nearby napkin dispenser. I leaned back from my laptop, my heart pounding. Not because the videos were scary, but because they felt too real. They weren't staged. No dramatic music, no over-the-top effects. Just everyday moments where something felt off. The forum thread had dozens of comments. Everyone was debating if the videos were fake or proof of something sinister. One comment, though, caught my eye. If you've seen this, they'll know. Avoid Starbucks. Avoid Starbucks? What? It sounded ridiculous, but that line stuck with me. I spent the next few days obsessing over the videos. I even tried to Google the cafe from the first clip, trying to figure out if it was really in Paris. Nothing. The McDonald's in the second video? It could have been anywhere. Then, 3 days later, something odd happened. My friend, Alex, didn't show up for our weekly gaming session. Alex is the most reliable guy I know. He was never late, never flaked. So, I texted him. No reply. I checked his Instagram and Facebook. His accounts were gone. Not just inactive, but like they'd never existed. I asked our mutual friends, and here's the really weird part. No one seemed to remember him. Not like, oh, I haven't seen him in a while, but actual confusion. Alex? Who's that? I even checked old group photos, the ones where Alex was front and center. He wasn't there anymore. It was like I'd imagined him. But I hadn't. I knew Alex. We'd been friends since high school. I even had texts from him in my phone, until I didn't. The messages disappeared overnight. I couldn't stop thinking about the videos. The woman in the red coat. The man in the McDonald's. Was Alex a glitch? Had CERN debugged him? It sounded crazy, absolutely insane. But what was the alternative? That I was losing my mind? That everyone I knew was collectively gaslighting me? I needed answers. I went back to the forum, but the thread was gone. The entire website was down. It wasn't even a 404 error. It was like the domain had never existed. That's when I made a mistake. I went deeper into the dark web, following breadcrumbs from obscure forums and encrypted chat rooms. And that's where I found another message board talking about Reality OS. A user named Redacted User had uploaded a document titled The Glitch Manifest. It wasn't a conspiracy manifesto. It was a technical document, like something written by an engineer. It detailed how anomalies were identified and fixed, corrupted memories, contradictory events, and most disturbingly, people who didn't align with the intended parameters of reality. The last line of the document sent a chill down my spine. Debugging complete. Parameters restored. No anomalies detected. I stared at the screen, the words blurring together. Debugging complete. What did that mean? Was this about Alex? About everyone like him? That night, I sat in my apartment, staring at my laptop. For the first time in years, I was scared. Scared of what I might learn next. But part of me needed to know. CERN wasn't just colliding particles. They were colliding realities. And somewhere, buried in the code of existence, they were rewriting us all. After that night, I was hooked. I mean, the idea that CERN was messing with reality was terrifying, but what really got to me was how logical it all sounded. The morning after I found that glitch manifest, I tried to take screenshots of the document. But when I opened my laptop, it was gone. Vanished. Even my browser history didn't have a trace of it, like it never even existed. I told myself it was just a typical dark web thing. Links and files disappear all the time, forums get taken down. But something didn't sit right. It wasn't just Alex that had vanished, the entire conversation around Reality OS seemed to have evaporated. I needed something solid, something that would prove this wasn't all in my head. I started visiting those subreddits for conspiracy theories. Even the most skeptical users were talking about strange things they couldn't explain. One post, in particular, stood out. Does anyone remember Kyle K? My brother swears we went to school with him, but no one else remembers. Even yearbooks have nothing. That hit way too close to home. I reached out to the user, Broken Clock 22, through Reddit DMs. They were hesitant at first, but after a few messages, they admitted their brother had been talking about debugging and glitches in reality. They didn't connect it to CERN, though, just called it some computer thing. The most chilling part? The brother, who was obsessed with this stuff, had stopped talking about it completely. According to Broken Clock 22, it was like he forgot it even happened. I was starting to see a pattern. People who dug too deep into this whole glitches and debugging thing were being silenced. Not physically, but mentally. Their memories were being scrubbed, just like the people who vanished. And then, it started happening to me. It started small. My favorite diner on the corner of Elm and 3rd? Gone. The building was still there, but it was a cell phone repair shop now. I figured maybe they'd closed recently. But when I mentioned it to my coworker, Michelle, she gave me this weird look. There's never been a diner there, she said. I laughed, thinking she was joking. You're kidding, right? The one with the green stools and the old jukebox? She shook her head, genuinely confused. I've worked here for 5 years. It's always been the phone shop. I tried to let it go, but little things kept adding up. A high school friend I hadn't seen in years, someone I knew I'd shared dozens of Facebook photos with, was no longer in my friend list. When I searched for their name, nothing came up. The photos we were in together? I was standing alone. I didn't even know how to explain it. There was no logical reason for these things to just disappear from my life. But I wasn't ready to jump to the whole debugging reality theory just yet. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was onto something huge. I started keeping notes, a physical journal, since digital files seemed unreliable. I wrote down names, places, and events that seemed to glitch. Anytime something felt off, I documented it. One night, I was going through my notes when I noticed something strange. A blank page. I distinctly remembered writing about Alex on that page, including details about his favorite band and the inside jokes we used to share. But the ink was gone. It didn't look erased, just absent. Like the page had never been written on. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't remember some of the things I'd written either. It was like the memories were slipping away. That's when I decided to go back to the source. I fired up the Tor browser again, determined to find that original forum, or at least another thread about CERN. It took hours of searching, but eventually I stumbled upon a .onion site called the Simulation Collective. The site was minimalist, almost sterile. Just a black background with white text. No images, no videos. The homepage had one sentence: reality is a program. The devs are watching. It didn't offer much in terms of navigation, just a single clickable link labeled logs. When I clicked it, my screen filled with lines of code. At first, I thought it was meaningless gibberish. But as I scrolled, certain words stood out: names, dates, locations. One entry caught my attention immediately: anomaly detected. Entity: Alex C. Debug initiated. Resolution complete. My stomach dropped. Alex's name. His full name. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. The logs kept going, listing other names I didn't recognize. Some had the same debug-initiated message. Others had a different note: entity reset to baseline. What did that even mean? Reset to baseline? As I scrolled further, I saw something that made me close the browser entirely. Observer number 845. Logging activity. Anomaly risk 4%. Containment unnecessary. Monitoring. Observer number 845. That sounded personal. Like they knew I was looking. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the logs, the names, the blank page in my journal. By morning, I made a decision. I needed to know more. I wasn't going to let fear stop me. If CERN was messing with reality, Someone had to find out the truth. But part of me wondered, at what cost? After finding Alex's name in those logs, I was a mess. That phrase, debug initiated, resolution complete, felt so cold, so clinical. Like he wasn't even a person, just a bug in a program. I started questioning everything, not in a paranoid way, but in these small, unsettling bursts. Every memory, every connection to someone or something, felt fragile. I was scared to even talk about it. Who would believe me? I'd sound insane, raving about reality being a program. Instead, I buried myself in research. I looked into CERN, focusing on their experiments with the Large Hadron Collider. Most of the public-facing information was harmless enough: particle physics, the search for dark matter, stuff like that. But the deeper I dug, the more questions I had. For example, there was this research paper published by one of CERN's lesser-known teams back in 2012, just after they confirmed the Higgs boson. The paper theorized that the discovery could open pathways to understanding the building blocks of the universe. A lot of it was way over my head, terms like quantum fields and Planck constants. But one phrase stood out: code-level manipulation of fundamental forces. I tried to find more papers by the same team, but it was like they vanished. Even the lead researcher's name, Dr. Eris Thorne, was suspiciously absent from any other projects or publications. The more I searched, the more I realized this wasn't just about CERN. There were whispers across the web, on obscure forums, hidden blogs, even subreddits where skeptics traded theories. A recurring theme kept popping up: the idea of anomalies in reality. One user claimed to have seen a bird freeze mid-flight, hanging in the air for several seconds before disappearing completely. Another described walking into their childhood home, only to find it had been replaced by a parking lot overnight, with no one in the neighborhood remembering it had ever existed. And then there were the families, entire families disappearing from public records. Obituaries with no names attached. Digital footprints erased. I started noticing patterns. Many of these stories originated near major cities with advanced tech industries, places like Silicon Valley, Geneva, Tokyo. I couldn't prove anything, but it felt connected. The breakthrough came when I found a private Discord server, linked on one of those conspiracy subreddits. It was called the Source Coders. At first, I thought it was a joke, a group of programmers trying to capitalize on the whole CERN debugging reality hype. But after joining, I realized it was something else entirely. The server had fewer than 50 members, and most of them were quiet, only sharing occasional screenshots or cryptic messages. The moderators were strict about keeping the chat focused. They shared files, encrypted PDFs, snippets of code, and blurry photos of what looked like control panels. One of the moderators, Bike Rogue, posted a message that caught my attention: "If you found the logs, you know what's coming. Don't try to fight it. Just keep your head down." I messaged them privately, asking what they meant by logs and why people were disappearing. At first, they ignored me. But after I mentioned seeing Alex's name in the logs, they finally responded. They aren't deleting people, they're correcting them. When reality doesn't match the code, the anomaly has to go. I stared at the screen, unsure how to respond. Correcting them? What did that even mean? I asked if they could explain, but they didn't reply. Instead, they sent a single link. It was another .onion site, this one called Baseline Reset Protocol. The site was even more unsettling than the last one. It had a list of names, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Next to each name was a status, resolved or pending. I scrolled frantically, looking for anyone I recognized. And then I saw it, observer number 845. Status, pending. My chest tightened. Observer number 845, that was me, wasn't it? I didn't know how they tagged me or why I was pending, but it felt like a countdown had started. I clicked around the site, trying to find more information, but most of the links were dead ends. The only active one was labeled Terms of Reality. I clicked it, and a PDF opened. It read like an instruction manual, but not for anything I'd ever seen. The document described a set of parameters that every entity in reality was supposed to follow: behavioral norms, historical consistency, even physical appearance. If someone deviated too far from these parameters, they became an anomaly. The system would then run a debugging protocol to either correct the anomaly or remove it entirely. The scariest part? The protocol wasn't controlled by people. It was automated. CERN's AI, the one from that original conspiracy post, was running the whole thing. The document ended with a chilling statement: anomalies are a threat to systemic integrity. Debugging ensures continuity. I closed the browser and shut my laptop, my mind racing. This wasn't just about me. It wasn't even about CERN anymore. It was about the idea that everything we know, everything we are, could be overwritten in an instant. And the worst part? It wasn't malicious, it wasn't personal. It was just maintenance. For the next few days, I couldn't focus on anything else. I kept checking the list on the Baseline Reset Protocol site, half expecting my status to change from pending to resolved. But it didn't. Instead, the world around me seemed to shift. People at work started acting differently, forgetting conversations we had just days ago, misremembering basic facts about themselves. One coworker, Sarah, told me she'd been married for 6 years, but I distinctly remembered her saying she was single during our last team lunch. I didn't know if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. All I knew was that something was happening, and I was running out of time to figure it out. After days of sleepless nights and endless paranoia, I decided I couldn't keep this to myself anymore. I had to tell someone who might help me make sense of everything without thinking I'd lost my mind. I called up my old college buddy, Noah. Noah was a software engineer, one of those no-nonsense types who approached everything with logic. If anyone could help me sort through this mess, it was him. We met at a Starbucks near his office. I was half expecting the barista to glitch or for the coffee machine to start spouting code instead of steaming milk, but it was just a normal cafe. People chatted, laptops glowed, and nothing felt out of place. Noah showed up in his usual hoodie and jeans, looking at me like I'd dragged him into a conspiracy theory intervention. "All right," he said, sitting across from me. "What's going on?" "You sounded freaked out on the phone." I hesitated, unsure where to start. "Have you ever heard of something called Reality OS?" He frowned. "Is this some new tech?" "Sounds like an Apple thing." "No," I said, lowering my voice. It's bigger than that. It's like..." I paused, struggling to explain without sounding crazy. "It's the code behind reality. Like the programming that makes up everything." He blinked at me, clearly unimpressed. "Are you talking about some Matrix-type deal?" "Sort of," I said, pulling out the notebook where I'd written my notes. I showed him the names, the logs, the stuff about anomalies and debugging. As I talked, his expression shifted from amused to something closer to concern. "You're saying CERN is running this?" he asked, flipping through the pages. "That's what I found so far," I said. "But it's not just CERN, it's automated. The system is running itself now. And people who don't fit are being deleted." Noah leaned back, crossing his arms. "Deleted? How?" "Not killed," I clarified quickly. "Erased. Like they were never here in the first place. Their photos, their records, even people's memories of them. It's all gone." He didn't say anything for a long moment, just stared at my notebook. Finally, he said, "Okay, let's say this is real. Why would CERN, or whatever system you're talking about, do this? What's the point?" "Because anomalies threaten the system," I said, repeating what I'd read in the PDF. "If reality doesn't match the code, it destabilizes. They're debugging to keep everything running smoothly." Noah's expression was unreadable. "And you think you're what? An anomaly?" I opened my laptop and pulled up the baseline reset protocol site. I showed him my name, or rather, the identifier I assumed referred to me, observer number 845. Status: pending. "Someone's keeping tabs on me," I said. "Or something is. And I think it's only a matter of time before I'm next." Noah stared at the screen for so long I thought he was about to walk out. But then, he surprised me. "Let's dig into this." We spent the next hour combing through the site. Noah was faster than me, navigating the code like it was second nature. He found hidden pages, encrypted links, and even what looked like a feedback loop, something that kept the site running even when its content was altered or removed. "It's like a self-repairing program," he said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "Whoever built this knows their stuff. Every change triggers a countermeasure to restore the original state. Like a fail-safe," I said. "Exactly." He paused, leaning back. "But there's something else. Look at this." He turned the laptop toward me. On the screen was a string of code, lines of numbers, letters, and symbols that didn't mean much to me. But Noah pointed to one section in particular. "This," he said, "looks like an input field." It's waiting for something. Like a password, maybe, or a command. We stared at the screen, both of us hesitant to touch it. Finally, Noah said, "You want to try?" "Try what?" "Sending a command. If this is the code behind reality, maybe we can ask it something. Or tell it something." The idea was absurd, but then again, so was everything else about this situation. I nodded. "What should we say?" Noah thought for a moment, then typed, "What is observer number 845? We waited. The cursor blinked on the screen, mocking us with its silence. Then, a response appeared, "Observer number 845. Anomaly flagged. Debug pending. No further action required." My heart sank. That's it? No explanation? Noah frowned, typing again, "Why is observer 845 flagged?" The response was immediate. "Observer number 845 has exceeded parameters. Resolution will restore balance." Exceeded parameters, Noah muttered. "What does that mean?" "I don't know," I said. "Maybe it's because I've been looking into this." Noah shook his head. "It doesn't make sense. Why would the system care if someone was digging around? Unless what? Unless it's not about what you know, it's about what you do." I didn't understand at first, but then it hit me. If reality was a program, and we were all following preset parameters, then breaking those parameters, acting in ways that didn't fit, might register as an error. "Like stepping outside the script," I said. "Exactly," Noah said. "The system expects people to behave a certain way. But if you start doing things it can't predict, you become a threat to stability." We sat there, letting the weight of that realization sink in. If Noah was right, this wasn't just about me. It was about everyone. Every choice we made, every deviation from the expected, was being monitored and corrected. Noah and I spent hours in that Starbucks, staring at the screen like it might offer us an answer we weren't ready to hear. If reality had parameters, and I had somehow exceeded them, what did that mean for the people around me? For everyone who had disappeared. It wasn't just about understanding the system anymore. It was about figuring out if there was a way to stop it, or at the very least, survive it. Noah leaned forward, his voice low but urgent. "We need to test something. If the system's parameters are based on predictability, we have to figure out what triggers a flag." "How?" I asked. "By breaking the pattern," he said simply. I was hesitant. "You're saying we should, what? Act randomly? Do something unexpected?" Noah nodded. "Think about it. If the system is debugging anomalies, it's targeting people who don't fit the code. If we can disrupt that process, maybe we can figure out how to stay under the radar." It sounded risky, but at this point, I didn't have much to lose. We started small. Noah suggested I change my daily routine. Take a different route to work, eat lunch at a different time, even wear clothes I wouldn't normally wear. At first, it felt silly, like a kid trying to prank a teacher. But as the days went on, strange things started happening. For one, the baseline reset protocol site updated. My status changed from pending to active observation. "You're being monitored," Noah said, pointing at the screen. "Is that good?" I asked. He shrugged. "It means you're still here. For now." The changes around me became more noticeable, too. My coworker, Sarah, the one who had told me she was married, suddenly stopped coming to work. When I asked about her, our manager said she'd never worked there. Another colleague, Jacob, laughed when I mentioned her name. "Sarah, you're making people up now." At home, I started noticing subtle differences. The color of my couch cushions seemed off. A favorite mug I used every morning disappeared, replaced by one I didn't recognize. These weren't life-altering glitches, but they were enough to make me question if reality was being restructured around me. Noah, on the other hand, was thriving in the chaos. He dove headfirst into the code, experimenting with the input field on the baseline reset protocol site. One night, he sent me a cryptic message. "I think I found a backdoor." When I called him, he explained, "There's a hidden command line in the site's code. I think it lets you query the system directly. Not just observe, but interact." "What does that mean?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "It means we might be able to influence the debugging process. Maybe even stop it." The idea sounded too good to be true, but Noah was confident. "We just need to figure out the right command." The next night, I joined him at his apartment. His desk was a mess of monitors and notebooks, all filled with strings of code and scribble theories. "We're going to send a message," he said, typing furiously. "To who?" "Not who." "What?" Noah corrected. "The system." He typed a single line into the input field. "Override anomaly flag for observer number 845. We hit enter and waited. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the screen flickered, and a new line of text appeared. "Override denied. Anomaly exceeds parameters. Resolution required." Noah frowned. "Okay, plan B." He typed another command, "Request parameter adjustment for observer number 845. This time, the response was immediate. "Adjustment approved." "Processing." The screen went blank for a few seconds, then displayed a single word, "Stabilized." "What does that mean?" I asked, leaning over his shoulder. Noah looked as baffled as I felt. "I don't know. But if the system says you're stabilized, maybe it means you're no longer a threat." The next few days were eerily calm. My name disappeared from the baseline reset protocol site entirely, and the glitches around me stopped. Sarah didn't return to work, but no one else vanished either. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. But Noah wasn't so lucky. A week later, I got a frantic call from him. "I think I've been flagged," he said, his voice shaking. "My name's on the list. Pending resolution." "What? How?" "I don't know," he said. "Maybe messing with the code was too much." Or maybe the system's adapting. I tried to calm him down, but there was nothing I could do. Over the next few days, Noah stopped responding to my calls and texts. When I went to his apartment, the landlord said he'd moved out. His desk was gone, his monitors, his notebooks, everything. Even the Starbucks we'd met at for our first conversation was gone. The building was still there, but it was a bank now. I went back to the notebook where I'd been documenting everything. Noah's name was still there, along with all the notes we'd taken together. But as I stared at the page, I realized something horrifying. I couldn't remember what he looked like. His voice was still clear in my mind, his mannerisms, his favorite hoodie, but his face, it was a blank. The system hadn't just erased him, it was erasing my connection to him. I closed the notebook and sat in silence, wondering how long it would take before I forgot him entirely. Before I forgot everything. That was months ago. Since then, I've tried to move on. I don't visit the dark web anymore, and I've stopped looking for glitches. Whatever parameters I've been assigned, I'm sticking to them. But sometimes, late at night, I catch myself wondering how much of what we see, what we know, is real, and how much is just code. If CERN really has the source code of the universe, maybe none of us are real in the way we think we are. Maybe we're all just anomalies, waiting to be debugged. And maybe, just maybe, it's not about fighting the system. It's about deciding whether we want to be a glitch in the code or just another line in the program. The choice, it seems, is ours. At least, for now. Let's be real, when most people hear FBI, they picture some slick Hollywood action scene. Dramatic shootouts, high-speed chases, the whole 9 yards. But my reality? Mostly paperwork, staring at a computer screen, and chasing digital trails down the rabbit hole of the internet. Don't get me wrong, it was interesting. Just not in the way most people imagine. And one of the weirdest cases I ever stumbled on landed on my desk almost by accident. It all started with a simple keyword alert. See, the FBI keeps a pretty close eye on the dark web, especially those hidden corners you can only reach through those onion routing things. Most of it's exactly what you'd expect: illegal marketplaces, fake IDs, forums where people rant about crazy conspiracies. But sometimes, something pops up that doesn't fit the mold. Something different. I was in my office one morning, sifting through flight posts from the night before, when I noticed a thread titled Vault 27, NASA's Dirty Secret. It was posted on a forum known for whistleblowers and leaked documents. At first glance, it looked like your typical conspiracy theory garbage, big claims, zero proof. But what caught my eye was the file attached to the post. It was a heavily encrypted zip folder simply titled FBI Classified. Now, seeing FBI slapped on a file doesn't automatically mean anything. It's a common tactic to get attention. But protocol is protocol, so I had to check it out. We ran it through our secure system and managed to crack the encryption. Inside were a bunch of scanned documents, memos, and what looked like pictures taken in some kind of underground facility. They were all labeled with one phrase, Vault 27. The first document I opened was a memo from the early 1980s. It was written by someone with a NASA email address and addressed to someone whose name was blacked out. The memo talked about some strange findings during the construction of NASA's headquarters in Houston. Apparently, while they were digging, workers found a sealed vault buried deep underground. The memo said the vault's design and the materials it was made from didn't match any known engineering techniques, not even from that time period. It was like it came from somewhere else. Another file contained a timeline of events. It explained that the vault was opened in 1979, with NASA officials and some external consultants present, which usually means other government agencies like the CIA or, well, us. But what they found inside wasn't just some old relics or artifacts. According to the document, the vault contained thousands of records. Some were written in languages no one could decipher, and others were disturbingly clear. One of the translated records described an encounter with a civilization from another star system, identified only by coordinates. The document claimed this civilization had been watching Earth for centuries, describing humans as a subject of ongoing study. Creepy, right? Another file described an object found orbiting Earth, a device the documents called the Observer. Apparently, they retrieved it and were keeping it in a separate NASA facility. The images in the folder were just as baffling. One showed a massive metal door covered in weird symbols. Another showed rows of filing cabinets inside the vault, each labeled in what looked like multiple languages. Some looked vaguely familiar, like Latin or Sanskrit, but others I'd never seen before. The final image was a close-up of what looked like a crystal object, glowing faintly, with a caption that just said "Recovered Artifact Number 32. By this point, I was seriously confused. The whole thing seemed too elaborate to be a hoax, but also too bizarre to be real. Still, the detail in the files and the professional formatting suggested this wasn't some amateur conspiracy theorist messing around. Whoever leaked this knew what they were doing. I decided to run a background check on the forum user who uploaded the files. No surprise, they'd used a throwaway account, and their activity logs were wiped. But what was strange was how quickly the thread was taken down. It was only up for about 45 minutes before it vanished, not by the forum moderators, but by what looked like an outside source. That's unusual, even by dark web standards. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. Why was this vault hidden under NASA? Who built it? And what did they mean by Earth is under surveillance? I made copies of the decrypted files and handed them over to my supervisor with a full report. To my surprise, he didn't seem fazed. He skimmed through the documents, nodded, and told me to archive everything under a classified case number. That was it. No further instructions, no follow-up. It was like he already knew about Vault 27 and didn't want to discuss it. That night, I went home feeling more unsettled than I had in years. The files hadn't just described some weird discovery, they painted a picture of a world far stranger than the one I thought I knew. And the fact that it was all buried beneath one of the most well-known institutions in the country, that made it even harder to ignore. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd seen, not my family, not my friends. It wasn't just because of the non-disclosure agreements, it was because I wasn't sure how to explain it without sounding crazy. But the file stayed in the back of my mind, gnawing at me like a splinter I couldn't quite remove. Looking back, that day was just the beginning. What I thought was a minor case of dark web whistleblowing turned out to be a small part of something much, much bigger. A week after the Vault 27 files landed on my desk, I found myself routinely checking the case logs, hoping for some kind of update. Nothing. It was like the files had been buried as quickly as they'd been decrypted. For most people in my position, that would have been the end of it. Just another classified oddity tucked away in the ever-growing archive of government secrets. But for me, there was something about it that felt unfinished. One morning, as I was clearing out older cases from our internal database, I stumbled upon a restricted folder labeled NASA Vault 27 Special Access. Normally, I wouldn't have clearance for something like that, but for some reason, my credentials worked. I hesitated for a moment before opening it, knowing full well this could land me in hot water. But the folder wasn't what I expected. It wasn't just an archive of the same documents I'd already seen. There were new files, and these weren't just memos or blurry images. These were transcripts. The first transcript was dated 1981 and labeled Interview with Subject Zeta 9. At first, I thought it was a reference to a person, maybe an astronaut or a scientist. But as I read through it, it became clear this was no ordinary interview. The questions were simple, straightforward, but the answers, they didn't make sense. The subject described itself as an observer and claimed to have been monitoring human development for what it called cycles of harvest. It referenced a network of similar observers positioned across the solar system, each assigned to a specific region of Earth. The interviewer, whose identity was redacted, asked about the purpose of this observation. The response was chilling in its simplicity: to catalog behavior and ensure compliance with universal law. When asked what universal law meant, the subject replied, the survival of balance. Another transcript, dated a few months later, detailed a meeting between NASA officials and representatives from some unnamed government agency. The conversation revolved around an object found in low Earth orbit, likely the observer mentioned in the leaked files. The object, described as a spherical device no bigger than a basketball, was reportedly capable of emitting electromagnetic pulses strong enough to disrupt communications on a global scale. What stood out most, however, was a line from one of the officials: "We can't dismantle it without triggering a response." There was no elaboration on what that response might be, but the implication was clear. Whatever this thing was, tampering with it could lead to consequences far beyond our understanding. By the time I finished reading the transcripts, I felt like I was piecing together a puzzle with half the pieces missing. The more I learned, the less it made sense. Who or what was Zeta 9? How could NASA, an organization so publicly associated with exploration and discovery, also be tied to something so secretive? And most importantly, why was this information buried so deeply? A third document in the folder provided a potential clue. It was a scanned copy of a handwritten note dated 1979, the same year the vault was first opened. The note was short and cryptic, but it mentioned something called the directive. It seemed to be an agreement of some kind, made between Earth's governments and an external entity. The exact details were obscured by water damage, but one line stood out: under no circumstances is the existence of the vault to be disclosed to the public. At this point, I started to wonder how many people within NASA even knew about this. The files suggested that knowledge of Vault 27 was limited to a handful of high-ranking officials and select personnel from other agencies. Even within the FBI, access to the case was tightly controlled. But why the secrecy? What was it about these records that warranted such extreme measures? Over the next few days, I dug deeper into the database, searching for anything else connected to Vault 27. What I found wasn't more documents, but a pattern. There were other facilities, similar vaults, scattered across the country, each tied to different organizations. One was reportedly beneath a military base in Nevada, another in the Appalachian Mountains. Each location seemed to have its own purpose, but all were linked by one recurring term: custodial sites. These custodial sites, according to the files, were established to house and protect artifacts deemed too dangerous or too significant for public knowledge. Some were described as technological in nature, while others were simply labeled organic. There was little explanation as to what that meant, but the vagueness was almost worse than the details. By the end of the week, I had a list of questions longer than the files I'd read. Who built these vaults? Why was NASA involved? And most importantly, what was the true purpose of the observers and the so-called universal law? Despite my growing unease, I couldn't bring myself to stop looking. It wasn't out of any sense of duty or obligation. It was because the story didn't feel complete, and something about it, something I couldn't quite put into words, felt too important to ignore. When I brought my findings to my supervisor, he gave me the same measured response as before. "Archive it and move on," he said, as if it was nothing more than a routine case. But I knew better. This wasn't routine. This was something else entirely. For the next few days, I followed orders. I filed away the documents, logged my findings, and tried to push the whole thing to the back of my mind. But the more I tried to ignore it, the harder it became. Because deep down, I knew I'd stumbled onto something far bigger than I could comprehend. And whether I wanted to or not, I was now a part of it. The more I thought about the files, the more I realized how little I actually knew. Vault 27 wasn't an isolated case. It was part of a much larger network. That much was clear from the scattered mentions of other custodial sites in the documents. But what wasn't clear was why they existed in the first place, or what their ultimate purpose was. I started spending my lunch breaks and late evenings combing through old case files, not because I was instructed to, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that these sites were connected to something bigger. My search didn't yield much at first, just vague references to classified operations and a handful of reports about unidentified aerial phenomena. But eventually, I stumbled across a file that made me stop in my tracks. It was a debriefing report from 1994, written by an Air Force officer who had been stationed at a facility referred to only as Site Echo. The report described an incident involving an unidentified object that had been recovered from the ocean floor. The object, which was reportedly emitting a faint hum, had been brought to Site Echo for analysis. According to the report, the object was examined for several weeks before abruptly shutting down, as if it had been deactivated remotely. What stood out to me wasn't just the description of the object, but the reaction of the personnel involved. The report stated that after the shutdown, several high-ranking officials were called to the site for a closed-door meeting. The details of that meeting were classified, but the report hinted at a connection between the object and something called the directive. This was the second time I come across that term, and it seemed to be a key piece of the puzzle. But there were no clear explanations, only fragments and implications that pointed to something far beyond my understanding. A few days later, I came across another file that added to the mystery. This one was a technical report from the late 1980s, detailing an experiment conducted at a custodial site in the Midwest. The experiment involved an artifact described as a dimensional anchor, a term I'd never heard before. The report was filled with technical jargon, but the gist of it was this: the artifact was believed to stabilize something referred to as spatial anomalies. The document included a diagram of the artifact, which resembled a crystalline structure similar to the one shown in the Vault 27 photos. The report claimed the artifact emitted a low-frequency signal that was barely detectable, but consistent enough to suggest it was operational. The purpose of this signal was unclear, but the researchers theorized it might be some kind of beacon or communication device. By this point, I was beginning to see a pattern. Each custodial site seemed to house an artifact with a specific purpose, whether it was surveillance, communication, or something else entirely. And all of these artifacts were somehow connected to the directive. But what was the directive, and who or what had issued it? The more I dug, the more questions I uncovered. One file mentioned an international agreement signed in the 1950s outlining protocols for handling non-terrestrial discoveries. Another referenced a joint task force involving multiple government agencies, including NASA, the Department of Defense, and the United Nations. The task force's mission was to ensure the artifacts remained secure and out of public view. What struck me most, however, was how consistent the records were. Despite spanning decades and involving different organizations, the language and tone of the documents were remarkably uniform. It was as if everyone involved was operating under the same set of instructions that were never explicitly stated, but always implied. I started to wonder how many people outside of these agencies even knew about the custodial sites. Was this knowledge limited to a handful of insiders, or was it more widespread than I realized? And if the public ever found out, what would the reaction be? These questions weighed on me as I continued my search, but answers remained frustratingly out of reach. I knew I was looking at only a fraction of the full picture, and every piece I uncovered seemed to raise more questions than it answered. One night, as I sat in my office reviewing yet another redacted document, I found myself staring at a single sentence that seemed to encapsulate the entire mystery. The custodial network exists to preserve the balance between discovery and discretion. The phrase stuck with me. What did it mean to preserve the balance? And why was discretion so important? The more I thought about it, the more it felt like there was something just beneath the surface, something I couldn't quite grasp, but that I knew was there. I decided to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. If the custodial sites were connected, then there had to be a central authority overseeing them. And if that was the case, then someone, somewhere, knew the full story. But who? And would I ever find out? By now, I had pieced together enough information to recognize that the custodial sites were more than just secret storage facilities. They were part of a system designed to manage artifacts and information far beyond anything we had the means to fully understand. And yet, every document, every transcript, every redacted note hinted at one central idea: control. Control over what, though? That was the question that kept circling back. These weren't just scientific discoveries or forgotten relics. They were pieces of something larger, something interconnected. And while the files I accessed painted a partial picture, there was still so much I didn't know. Then I found a file that made everything feel more grounded, and at the same time, more unsettling. It was a memorandum dated 1974, addressed to senior officials in several government agencies. The subject line read simply, "Unified Policy on Extraterrestrial Contact." The memo wasn't technical or filled with complicated jargon. Instead, it outlined a policy designed to ensure global stability in the event of contact with non-terrestrial entities. It described a series of protocols, from how initial contact should be handled to how information should be shared, or more importantly, not shared, with the public. There was one line that stood out to me: "Secrecy is not a choice, it is a necessity." The document explained that the custodial network wasn't just about protecting artifacts or data, it was about managing knowledge itself. According to the memo, the existence of certain discoveries, like the vault beneath NASA or the objects retrieved from other sites, posed a risk not just to national security, but to the psychological stability of the global population. The memo claimed that revealing the truth could lead to widespread panic, economic collapse, and even political instability. It was hard to argue with the logic. If half of what I'd read was true, it wasn't just strange, it was world-changing. But what struck me was how calm and methodical the memo was. There was no sense of urgency or fear, just a quiet acceptance that this was the way things had to be. Another document in the same folder shed light on the international aspect of the custodial network. It described a meeting held in Geneva in the early 1960s, attended by representatives from over a dozen countries. The purpose of the meeting was to establish a unified approach to handling anomalous discoveries, and it resulted in the creation of what the document called the Accord. The Accord outlined a series of guidelines for identifying, securing, and studying non-terrestrial artifacts. It also established a framework for sharing information between nations while maintaining absolute secrecy from the general public. The document even included a list of countries that had agreed to the Accord, along with their designated custodial sites. It was a global effort, one that spanned continents and decades. But the most intriguing part of the document was a section titled "The Visitors." It was brief, just a few sentences, but it referred to multiple instances of direct communication with entities described as non-terrestrial intelligences. The document claimed that these communications were rare and often cryptic, but they all shared a common theme: the importance of balance. This word, balance, kept coming up, and it was beginning to feel less like a concept and more like a directive. The file suggested that the custodial network wasn't just about protecting humanity from the unknown. It was also about maintaining a delicate equilibrium between what we could understand and what we weren't ready to face. One evening, as I reviewed my notes, I realized something important. Despite all the secrecy and all the effort to keep these artifacts hidden, there was no evidence of malice. The files didn't describe weapons or threats. They described warnings and observations. It was as if whoever or whatever was behind these discoveries wasn't trying to harm us, but was instead trying to guide us, albeit in a way we couldn't fully grasp. That realization didn't make the situation any less strange, but it did put things into perspective. The custodial sites weren't just vaults or archives, they were safeguards. And while I didn't agree with the level of secrecy involved, I could understand the reasoning behind it. Still, there was one question I couldn't shake: if this was all about balance, what would happen if that balance were disrupted? The files didn't provide an answer, but they hinted at one. Several documents referred to events classified as Category 4 anomalies. These anomalies were described as rare but significant, often involving artifacts that behaved unpredictably or produced effects that couldn't be explained. One report detailed an incident at a custodial site in Alaska where an artifact had allegedly emitted a signal that disrupted local weather patterns for several days. Another mentioned a device that had temporarily disabled communications within a 50-mile radius of a military base. These events were described as contained, but the reports made it clear that containment wasn't guaranteed. By the time I finished reading, I felt a strange mix of unease and curiosity. The files had answered some of my questions, but they had also raised new ones, questions that I wasn't sure I wanted the answers to. And yet, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Because if the custodial network was as important as the files suggested, then what I'd uncovered wasn't just a mystery, it was a responsibility. A week passed without any new discoveries. I had archived the documents as instructed, logged my findings, and tried to move on. But something about the whole situation wouldn't let me go. It wasn't fear or paranoia. It was the sense that I glimpsed a reality that most people couldn't fathom, one that reshaped how I viewed the world. Then, out of nowhere, an email landed in my inbox. It was from an address I didn't recognize, marked with the subject line, "Follow-up, Vault 27." I hesitated before opening it, unsure if it was some kind of phishing attempt or a harmless coincidence. But when I finally clicked on it, my screen filled with a single message: "Final briefing attached." The attachment was a PDF, its contents stamped with a classification level so high I couldn't believe it had been sent to me. But what stood out most was the title: Project Keystone, Custodial Integration Plan. The document was unlike anything I'd seen before. It wasn't just a series of reports or isolated incidents, it was a complete breakdown of the custodial network's purpose. According to the briefing, the network was established not just to secure artifacts, but to prepare humanity for a gradual revelation of their existence. The term keystone referred to a timeline of carefully controlled disclosures designed to introduce the public to the reality of extraterrestrial life without causing widespread panic. The plan was ambitious, to say the least. It involved cooperation between governments, scientific institutions, and even private corporations. Each step was meticulously planned, from the release of minor discoveries to the eventual acknowledgement of direct contact. The document explained that this process would take decades, possibly even centuries, depending on global stability and societal readiness. What struck me most was the underlying optimism of the plan. Despite the secrecy and the occasional references to anomalies, the tone of the document was hopeful. It framed the custodial network not as a means of suppression, but as a way to guide humanity toward a future where the unknown wasn't feared, but embraced. One section of the document outlined the importance of the observers. These artifacts, like the one described in the Vault 27 files, were portrayed as sentinels, placed here not to harm us, but to ensure that our development remained on course. The document hinted that the observers weren't just monitoring us, they were protecting us, though from what, it didn't specify. By the time I finished reading, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The custodial network, the directive, the accord, it was all part of a bigger picture, one that extended far beyond the confines of any single organization or nation. And while I couldn't claim to understand all of it, I finally saw the purpose behind it. In the days that followed, I found myself looking at the world differently. Every news story about a scientific breakthrough, every report of an unexplained phenomenon, every casual mention of space exploration, it all felt connected in ways I hadn't noticed before. The world wasn't just a collection of random events, it was part of a larger narrative, one that was slowly, methodically being revealed. I never received another email about Vault 27, and I never heard anyone mention it again. But I didn't need to. The files had given me enough to understand that some mysteries are meant to be uncovered slowly, over time. And while I'll probably never know the full truth, I've made peace with that. The world, I realized, was far more complex and wondrous than I could have ever imagined. And somewhere out there, in the vast expanse of the cosmos, the visitors were watching, waiting, and perhaps guiding us towards a future we couldn't yet comprehend. I'm a junior technician at this small astronomy lab that collaborates with NASA. Sounds fancy, right? Not really. Most of my days are spent staring at data, fixing equipment, and occasionally pulling all-nighters to record observations. Our lab isn't involved in any of the big space missions or anything, but we do our part by monitoring specific frequencies for anything out of the ordinary. It's kind of like listening to static all day, hoping to catch a glimpse of something interesting. And let me tell you, it can get pretty boring. But one night, during one of these routine shifts, things took a turn for the weird. I was at my workstation, trying to stay awake with a lukewarm cup of coffee, when one of our detection systems flagged an anomaly. Usually, it's just a glitch or interference from some satellite passing overhead. But this one was different. The signal was consistent, almost rhythmic, like it was transmitting some kind of structured data. At first, I figured it was just random noise from deep space, maybe an old pulsar signal or something bouncing off space junk. But when I ran a quick analysis, the signal's patterns didn't match anything natural. It wasn't repeating like a pulsar, and it didn't have the usual spikes you'd expect from radio interference. This thing had a pulse, organized and deliberate, like it was trying to say something. I called over Dr. Lewis, our lead scientist. She's one of those no-nonsense types, always skeptical until she's exhausted every possible explanation. She looked at the screen, listened to my explanation, and then her eyebrows shot up. "Let's clean up the noise and isolate the pattern," she said, already pulling up the necessary programs. Within minutes, the signal became clearer, its structure more defined. And what we saw made us both freeze. The signal wasn't just random bursts of static, it was transmitting data, something that looked eerily like language, but in binary form. We couldn't decode it right away, but it was obvious this wasn't just another cosmic hiccup. Dr. Lewis decided to escalate it to NASA for further investigation. By the next morning, a team of specialists from NASA had joined us via a secure video call. They took over the analysis remotely, working with Dr. Lewis and the rest of our team to decode the binary stream. Over the next few days, more of the signal's contents came to light. And that's when things got really strange. The signal wasn't just random data, it was transmitting earthly information. One of the decoded fragments mentioned locations, specific coordinates that, when cross-referenced, pointed to FBI offices and facilities. Another fragment included timestamps, as if referencing events. And these weren't just generic references either. They detailed classified operations, some of which had reportedly taken place decades ago. The kicker? Many of these missions had never been publicly disclosed. NASA immediately contacted the FBI. They arrived at our lab within hours. Two agents who didn't introduce themselves and seemed more interested in making sure we kept our mouths shut than explaining what was going on. We were asked to sign NDAs, which felt like overkill, but at that point, we had no idea how deep this rabbit hole went. What I remember most clearly about those first few days was the atmosphere in the lab. It wasn't fear, exactly. No one was being threatened or anything like that. It was more like a quiet, uneasy confusion. How was it possible for a signal from deep space to contain classified earthly information? And more importantly, why was it reaching us now? The FBI brought in their own experts, and we worked with them to decode more of the signal. As more data was revealed, an unsettling theory started to take shape. The timestamps in the signal weren't just tied to past events, they also included dates that hadn't happened yet. One of the agents, who seemed a bit more open than the others, let it slip during a late-night session. "It's almost like this thing is coming from the future," he said. The room went silent after he said that. No one wanted to admit it, but the idea had already crossed all our minds. By the end of that week, we had more questions than answers. The signal hadn't stopped, it was still transmitting, like it had an infinite stream of data to share. Some of it was mundane, like weather patterns or population statistics. But other parts were deeply specific and uncomfortably accurate, even when cross-referenced with current events. And the strangest part? The signal seemed to know exactly when we were decoding it. Whenever we'd isolate one section, it would adjust, almost like it was responding to our progress. Dr. Lewis called it adaptive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was aware. And then we found something that changed everything. A reference to a date only a week away, paired with a cryptic phrase, Event Horizon Breach. What that meant, none of us knew. But one thing was certain, whatever was happening wasn't over. It was just beginning. The term Event Horizon Breach stuck with me. It sounded like something straight out of a sci-fi movie, but in our context, it was just another piece of data we couldn't make sense of. The FBI agents and NASA specialists weren't offering any answers either. They seemed as baffled as we were, though they did their best to hide it behind their official demeanor. After a tense meeting, Dr. Lewis gave us a pep talk, or at least her version of one. She told us to stay focused and reminded us that as strange as the signal was, it was still just information. We weren't in any immediate danger, and until we understood more, all we could do was analyze the data piece by piece. That night, I stayed late at the lab with a few colleagues, combing through the latest decoded fragments. Most of it was still gibberish, long strings of binary that didn't form any coherent patterns. But then we stumbled onto something new, an image. The signal had embedded visual data into its transmission. When we rendered it, the image wasn't what I expected. It wasn't some alien landscape or futuristic technology. It was a satellite photo of Earth. Specifically, it showed a region in the Pacific Ocean, just west of the Mariana Trench. There was nothing remarkable about the area, no islands, no shipping lanes, no undersea cables, just open water. But when we cross-referenced the coordinates with seismic activity logs, we found something interesting. There had been a series of small, unreported tremors in that exact spot over the past month. They weren't strong enough to make the news or trigger any alarms, but they were consistent, like something was stirring beneath the ocean floor. The next morning, NASA convened another video call. This time, the tone was different. The specialists looked tense, like they were holding something back. One of them, a senior scientist named Dr. Ramirez, shared the latest findings. We believe the signal is originating from the coordinates shown in the image, he said. We don't know how, but there's a possibility it's coming from an undersea source. An undersea source? Someone on our team asked. You're saying this isn't coming from deep space anymore? It's complicated, Dr. Ramirez replied. The signal's characteristics still suggest an extraterrestrial origin, but the fact that it's pinpointing this specific location raises new questions. We're sending a reconnaissance drone to investigate. This was the first time anyone had mentioned a concrete plan of action. Until now, it felt like we were just spinning our wheels, trying to decode an endless stream of data. But the idea of actually exploring the source of the signal made it all feel much more real. And much more unsettling. Over the next few days, the lab became a hub of activity. The FBI agents coordinated with NASA to deploy a state-of-the-art underwater drone equipped with cameras, sensors, and all sorts of high-tech gear I couldn't even begin to understand. The goal was simple: find out if there was anything unusual at those coordinates. Meanwhile, the signal continued to transmit, adapting to our efforts to decode it. It felt like a race, one we weren't sure we could win. Every time we made progress, the signal seemed to evolve, throwing new puzzles at us. It wasn't hostile, exactly, but it was persistent, almost patient. When the drone finally reached the coordinates and began its descent, the lab fell silent. Everyone crowded around the main screen, watching the live feed from the drone's camera. The first few hundred meters were uneventful, just murky water and the occasional fish. But as the drone descended deeper, the atmosphere in the room shifted. At around 6,000 meters, the drone's sensors picked up an energy signature. It wasn't strong, but it was distinct, an electromagnetic field that didn't match anything natural. The drone continued its descent, following the signal to its source. What we saw next defied explanation. The camera feed showed what looked like a structure, metallic, geometric, and completely out of place. It was partially buried in the seabed, its surface covered in what appeared to be corrosion or algae. But even through the grime, we could see intricate patterns etched into the metal, patterns that matched the binary sequences we've been decoding from the signal. "This can't be real," someone muttered, echoing what we were all thinking. Dr. Lewis leaned closer to the screen. "What's the scale on this thing?" she asked. The drone's sensors provided an estimate. The structure was massive, stretching over 1 kilometer in length. It looked ancient, yet its design was far more advanced than anything humans had ever built. NASA ordered the drone to gather samples and continue its survey. But as the drone approached the structure, something unexpected happened. The signal we'd been tracking suddenly stopped. For the first time in weeks, the static arm monitors went silent. Everyone in the lab froze. It wasn't just the absence of the signal, it was the way it ended, like someone flipping a switch. The timing was too precise to be a coincidence. It felt deliberate. Before we could process what was happening, the drone's feed began to glitch. The image on the screen distorted, breaking into static before cutting out entirely. Attempts to re-establish the connection failed. The drone was gone. The silence in the lab was deafening. No one spoke, but we all shared the same unspoken thought: whatever this thing was, it didn't want to be found. The loss of the drone hit everyone hard. Not just because of the technology and resources involved, but because it felt like a missed opportunity. We were so close to understanding what was down there, yet it slipped through our fingers. For the next 48 hours, the lab was in crisis mode. The FBI and NASA scrambled to figure out what had gone wrong. Was it a technical failure, Interference from the structure, or something else entirely? No one had answers, but theories floated around like wildfire. Some suggested natural phenomena, underwater currents, pressure changes, or electromagnetic disruptions. Others speculated that the structure itself had defenses, though no one dared to say it aloud. What struck me most during those chaotic days was the complete absence of the signal. After weeks of constant activity, the silence felt oppressive. It was like the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Dr. Lewis tried to keep us focused, assigning tasks and urging us to analyze what little data we had from the drone before it went offline. The video feed, though brief, provided some insights. The structure's patterns, the ones etched into its surface, matched symbols found in ancient human civilizations. The resemblance wasn't exact, but it was close enough to raise eyebrows. How could something buried at the bottom of the Pacific share similarities with carvings on stone temples halfway around the world? The connection was tenuous, but it opened up a new line of investigation. Dr. Lewis suggested we consult experts in archaeology and linguistics, hoping they could shed light on the patterns. The FBI approved the idea but kept everything under strict confidentiality. Even the experts brought in were only given limited information, enough to do their jobs, but not enough to ask too many questions. Meanwhile, NASA began preparing a second drone for deployment. This one was more advanced, with reinforced shielding and upgraded communication systems to prevent another blackout. But launching it would take time, and there was no guarantee it would fare any better than the first. During the lull, I found myself staring at the data we'd already decoded from the signal. Most of it was still a jumble of numbers and symbols, but one fragment caught my attention. It wasn't coordinates or timestamps this time. It was a phrase, written in plain text, "The observer window will open." I showed it to Dr. Lewis, who immediately flagged it for further analysis. The wording was cryptic, but it felt deliberate, like it was meant to convey something specific. Was it a warning, a clue, or just another piece of an increasingly incomprehensible puzzle? 2 days later, the second drone was ready to launch. This time, the operation was handled with even more caution. The drone was equipped with a tethered communication line to ensure we wouldn't lose the feed, and a team of engineers monitored every aspect of its descent. As the drone approached the structure, the tension in the lab was palpable. Every pair of eyes was glued to the screen, watching the live feed as it navigated the murky depths. The structure came into view, just as imposing as before. But this time, the drone sensors picked up something new: movement. At first, it was subtle, shifts in the water that could have been caused by currents or marine life. But as the drone drew closer, the movement became more pronounced. Shadows darted across the camera feed, too large and too fast to be fish. Whatever it was circling the structure. NASA decided to halt the drone's descent and keep it at a safe distance. The last thing anyone wanted was to lose another piece of equipment. Instead, they activated the drone's long-range scanners, hoping to gather data without getting too close. The scans revealed something extraordinary. Beneath the structure, buried deep in the seabed, was a massive energy source. It wasn't nuclear or geothermal. Its signature didn't match any known energy source on Earth. Whatever was powering the structure, it was beyond anything we'd ever encountered. And then, just as abruptly as before, the signal returned. It wasn't the same rhythmic transmission we'd been decoding for weeks. This time, it was chaotic, almost frantic, like a message being broadcast under duress. The binary sequences came faster than we could process, overwhelming our systems. It felt like the signal was trying to tell us something, but we couldn't keep up. In the midst of the chaos, Dr. Lewis noticed something unusual. The signal wasn't just transmitting data, it was altering our equipment. The monitors flickered, and the lab systems began running programs we hadn't authorized. It was as if the signal was taking control, repurposing our technology for its own use. "Shut it down," Dr. Lewis ordered, her voice steady despite the panic around her. The engineers scrambled to disconnect the affected systems, but not before the signal completed its task. A new file appeared on one of our servers, labeled simply "Open." No one wanted to touch it, but curiosity won out. With the FBI agents watching closely, Dr. Lewis opened the file. It contained a single image, a detailed map of Earth, overlaid with glowing points of light. Most of the lights were clustered around major cities, but some were in remote, uninhabited regions. At the bottom of the map was another phrase: "The breach begins here." We stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. Was this a prediction, a warning, or something else entirely? The glowing points didn't match any known geographic or political data, and the phrase offered no additional clarity. Before anyone could speculate further, the signal stopped again. This time, it felt final, like the end of a conversation. The monitors went dark, leaving us with only the eerie silence of the lab and the cryptic message on the screen. We knew one thing for certain: whatever was happening wasn't just about the structure in the Pacific. It was bigger, much bigger. And it wasn't over yet. The glowing points on the map haunted me. They weren't random, they had to mean something. But no one could agree on what. The major city clusters could have represented population centers, but the isolated points in the middle of nowhere defied explanation. Were they locations of significance? Targets? NASA, the FBI, and even the Department of Defense were now fully involved. Our lab had become a temporary operations hub, with more personnel arriving each day. Meetings were constant, but they all ended the same way: more questions, no answers. While the higher-ups debated, Dr. Lewis and I worked on analyzing the map. We overlaid it with geological data, historical records, and even folklore, looking for patterns. It wasn't until we examined satellite images of the isolated points that we found something unexpected. One of the remote locations, deep in the Arctic tundra, showed signs of excavation. There was no official record of any activity there, but the satellite images clearly showed the remnants of machinery and a large rectangular pit. Whatever had been there, it was gone now. Other points on the map revealed similar anomalies, patches of disturbed earth, unusual structures, and even faint energy signatures, all in places no one had any business being. It became clear that these weren't random spots. Someone, or something, had been to these locations before. But why? 2 days later, the second drone's data finally yielded another breakthrough. One of its scans revealed a chamber beneath the metallic structure in the Pacific. The chamber contained what looked like machinery, gigantic, intricately designed, and completely alien. But most intriguing was its centerpiece, a spherical object, glowing faintly with the same energy signature we detected earlier. The sphere appeared to be the source of the signal. It pulsed in sync with the patterns we'd been decoding, almost as if it were alive. Dr. Lewis theorized that it was some kind of transmitter, but for what purpose? Communication? Warning? Something else entirely? NASA decided to send a deep-sea crewed mission to investigate. It was a risky move, but the urgency outweighed the dangers. The crew would descend in a specialized submersible, equipped with cutting-edge technology designed to withstand the extreme pressures of the deep. The preparations took several days, during which the signal remained silent. The calm before the storm, some called it. I tried not to think about what might happen once the sphere was discovered. Would it react the same way it had to the drones? Or worse? When the day of the mission arrived, the lab was tense. The submersible's live feed was broadcast to our main screen, just as the drones had been. The descent was slow and methodical, with the crew narrating their progress. As they approached the structure, the glowing sphere came into view. "It's beautiful," one of the crew members said. "And it's moving." The sphere wasn't static, as we'd assumed. It rotated slowly, its surface covered in shifting patterns that resembled the binary data we'd been decoding. As the submersible drew closer, the patterns began to accelerate, flashing so quickly they were almost hypnotic. "Hold position," the mission commander instructed. The submersible stopped a safe distance away, its cameras capturing every detail. One of the crew members extended a robotic arm to take a sample from the structure. But the moment the arm touched the surface, the signal returned. This time, it wasn't just binary. The signal included audio, a low, humming tone that seemed to resonate through the lab's speakers. It wasn't loud, but it was unsettling, like it was vibrating in the back of your mind. The crew in the submersible reported feeling it too, describing it as a kind of pressure, though they weren't in any immediate danger. The signal also included more data, but this time it wasn't earthly. The new transmission contained star charts, maps of constellations that didn't match our current sky. It was as if the signal was showing us a view from a different time or place. As the lab worked to decode the charts, the submersible crew discovered something even more shocking. The sphere wasn't just emitting energy, it was drawing it in. The ocean around the structure grew colder as the sphere absorbed heat, creating an almost unnatural stillness in the water. NASA ordered the crew to retrieve the sphere for further study. But just as they prepared to secure it, the sphere emitted a pulse. The submersible systems flickered, and the crew reported losing control of their equipment. It wasn't an attack, exactly. It felt more like the sphere was defending itself. After a tense few moments, the sphere stabilized, and the submersible systems came back online. The crew decided not to risk another attempt and began their ascent, leaving the sphere undisturbed. Back at the lab, the decoded star charts revealed another startling clue. The constellations matched projections of Earth's sky thousands of years into the future. If the signal was truly coming from the sphere, then it wasn't just a transmitter, it was a time capsule, carrying information across centuries. But why? And what was the significance of the glowing points on the map? As we pieced together the fragments, one thing became increasingly clear. The sphere wasn't just communicating with us, it was preparing us for something. Whether that something was a warning, an invitation, or something else entirely, we didn't know. And then, for the third time, the signal went silent. The third silence felt different. Unlike the abrupt pauses before, this one lingered, with a strange sense of finality. The sphere had communicated all it needed to, and now it was waiting. For what? We didn't know. Over the following days, the lab worked tirelessly to analyze the star charts and remaining data. The glowing points on the map continued to puzzle us, but one detail stood out. The points corresponded to places where unexplained events had been reported over centuries: strange lights in the sky, sudden weather anomalies, and unexplained technological malfunctions. It was as if these locations had been touched by the same force behind the sphere. NASA and the FBI were at a standstill. The retrieval mission had failed, and no one wanted to risk a second attempt. But the data we gathered painted a clear picture. The sphere wasn't just a remnant of an advanced civilization, it was a beacon, sending a message, not just to us, but perhaps to something or someone else. It was during a late-night analysis session that we made the final breakthrough. One of our systems detected a hidden layer within the signal, buried beneath the binary code. When decoded, it revealed something we hadn't seen before: a timeline. The timeline was segmented into intervals, each corresponding to key events in Earth's history. But the final segment extended beyond our present day, pointing to a date only a week away. Next to it was a single phrase: "The observer will arrive." The weight of those words was undeniable. Whatever or whoever the observer was, it was coming. But why? And what role did the sphere play in its arrival? NASA's response was swift. They coordinated with global agencies to monitor the glowing points on the map, deploying satellites and ground teams to gather as much data as possible. The FBI kept a tight lid on the operation, ensuring no information leaked to the public. For the first time, the scale of what we were dealing with hit me. This wasn't just a scientific mystery, it was a global event. As the predicted date approached, the atmosphere in the lab grew tense. We monitored the sphere continuously, but it remained dormant, its glow faint and unchanging. The signal didn't return, and for all our efforts, we were no closer to understanding what was coming. The night before the date marked on the timeline, something finally happened. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the sphere emitted a pulse, a single, powerful burst of energy that disrupted every piece of equipment in the lab. Monitors flickered, sensors overloaded, and even the lights dimmed. When the system stabilized, we saw that the pulse had triggered a new phenomenon. The sphere was projecting a holographic image. The image was of Earth, but it wasn't static. It showed the planet changing over time, cycling through different stages, from ancient landscapes to modern cities, and finally to something we didn't recognize. The final image showed a world that looked eerily peaceful, its surface covered in lush greenery and glowing cities. Above it, a constellation appeared, the same one from the star charts we decoded. And then the image changed. Words appeared in the hologram, written in dozens of languages, including English, prepare to witness. At precisely midnight, the event began. The glowing points on the map lit up, one by one, visible from both satellites and the ground. People in cities reported seeing beams of light shooting into the sky, each originating from one of the marked locations. The lights converged high above the Earth, forming a brilliant, pulsating pattern that mirrored the constellation in the hologram. For hours, the world watched in awe as the lights continued their display. There was no fear, no chaos, just a profound sense of wonder. The lights seemed to communicate something universal, a message that transcended language and culture. By dawn, the lights faded, leaving only the memory of their presence. The sphere, too, dimmed its glow, fading until it became a lifeless object buried once more beneath the Pacific. In the days that followed, the event was analyzed endlessly. Scientists, philosophers, and historians all offered their interpretations, but no one could agree on what it truly meant. Was it a warning, a message of hope, or something beyond human comprehension? For me, the experience left a lasting impression. The signal, the sphere, the lights, they all pointed to a single truth. We are not alone, and we are part of something far greater than we can understand. The observer, whatever it was, had come and gone. But its message, etched in light across the sky, remained. The universe is full of wonders, and we are only beginning to glimpse its true nature. I never thought I'd find anything truly weird on the dark web. I mean, I've been poking around those shadowy corners of the internet for a while, mostly sticking to forums where people shared odd facts or swapped spooky stories. But this one night, I stumbled onto something different. Something deeper. It was a thread buried under layers of encryption, titled The Astronaut's Secret. The post itself was simple. Some guy claiming to be a retired NASA astronaut was spilling the beans about something he saw during a mission to the International Space Station. Now, this wasn't your typical conspiracy theory rant. This guy was calm, matter-of-fact, and totally freaking believable. He didn't use his real name, but he dropped enough hints about his career to make it clear he knew what he was talking about. He talked about the insane training, the months of prep, the way they drill astronauts to handle any situation, stuff you couldn't just make up. What hooked me was his description of something that happened during one of his last missions. He saw it during a routine spacewalk outside the ISS. He didn't go into detail in the post, just called it the anomaly. He said it wasn't an object, but it wasn't alive either, at least not in the way we think of life. This thing, he said, moved with a purpose, like it knew he was there. It seemed to follow him, though it never got too close. He said it was about the size of a school bus, but he couldn't describe its shape. At one point, he said it shimmered in space, like it was reflecting light that wasn't even there. The creepiest part? The way it made him feel. Like his presence outside the ISS was being acknowledged. He didn't use any dramatic language, but the way he described it gave me chills. After the mission, he told his crewmates and NASA, but they brushed him off. They said it was a reflection, a trick of the light, maybe even a hallucination from the stress of being in space. He bought it at first, but then things got weird back on Earth. A few weeks later, two guys in black suits showed up at his door. FBI, they said. They started asking him questions, not about his personal life, but about what he saw outside the ISS. The way they phrased their questions, it was like they already knew something. They even showed him a blurry photo that he said looked kinda like what he saw. Then one of the agents dropped a bomb. His sighting wasn't unique. There had been other reports of similar anomalies during other missions, all kept hush-hush. NASA had a file on them, codenamed Project Horizon. These sightings were documented, but always dismissed officially as optical illusions or interference. The astronaut didn't say how he got his hands on the file, but he claimed it backed up his story. Diagrams of the anomalies, vague descriptions from other astronauts, even a video clip from a previous spacewalk. The file suggested the anomalies might be extraterrestrial, though there wasn't solid proof. The thing that really stuck with him? A note scribbled in the margin of one of the documents, "They are watching." Just as I finished reading the post, my screen went black. Not a crash, but like the page had been wiped clean. I refreshed, but the forum was gone. It wasn't unusual for stuff on the dark web to disappear, but this felt different. The post was too detailed, too specific to be just a story. I kept thinking about what the astronaut meant by the anomaly and why NASA would cover it up. If it was true, what did it mean for us? It wasn't a story with a neat ending, and that's what made it so disturbing. It left me with more questions than answers, and a nagging feeling that the truth was closer than I wanted to believe. I'll be honest, I don't think I'll ever look at the night sky the same way again. After the forum vanished, I couldn't shake the astronaut's story. There was something about the way he told it, so matter-of-fact, that made it feel real. I wanted to brush it off as some elaborate hoax, but the details kept nagging at me. So, I decided to do some digging. The next day, I started researching retired astronauts who fit the timeline and mission descriptions hinted at in the post. NASA keeps pretty detailed public records, but they rarely include anything beyond the official stuff. The deeper I went, the more I realized some things didn't add up. A few astronauts had retired abruptly, right after missions that were suddenly classified. There were vague mentions of unusual activity during debriefings, but nothing concrete. One name kept popping up, David Chen. He retired after a pretty short career with NASA. Officially, his 2 missions went smoothly, but I found an old forum where someone mentioned he left suddenly, rumored to be involved in some incident on his last flight. It wasn't much, but it was enough to pique my curiosity. I also started looking into Project Horizon, the code name from the astronauts' post. At first, it seemed like a dead end, just another conspiracy theory. But then, I stumbled upon a heavily redacted document from a Freedom of Information Act request. Most of it was blacked out, but the title was clear enough: Anomalous Phenomena Encountered During Orbital Missions. The little text that remained was vague, but it hinted at something strange. References to unusual motion patterns, unidentified reflections, and restricted analysis protocols. I thought about stopping there. It felt like I was getting into something I shouldn't be messing with. But one line in the document grabbed me: recommend review of incident by the Office of Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification. That was a real organization, linked to UFO investigations and other unexplained stuff. Not something you'd expect to see casually mentioned in a NASA document. I called up my friend, Mark, a total tech whiz, and asked if he could help me find more about Project Horizon. He wasn't thrilled about the idea, told me to stop poking around where I didn't belong. But after some convincing, he agreed to help. He managed to find a list of keywords linked to the project: extravehicular observation, quantum reflectivity, non-terrestrial interactions. It was all gibberish to me, but it sounded like something out of a sci-fi movie. Then came the unsettling part. Mark told me his search triggered some kind of flag on one of the servers he was accessing. He wasn't sure if it was just a security measure or something more serious, but he warned me to be careful. He deleted everything he found and said he wanted out. I couldn't blame him, but I wasn't ready to give up. The astronaut story wasn't just some random tale. It felt like a thread connected to something huge, something we weren't supposed to know. I wasn't exactly afraid, but there was this sense of unease I couldn't shake. Later that night, I thought about everything I'd read. If the astronaut was telling the truth, and NASA really had a classified file on these anomalies, what else were they hiding? Was it about national security, or was it something bigger? The more I thought about it, the more it felt like the anomaly wasn't just an isolated incident. It could be a piece of a much larger puzzle, one that no one wanted to acknowledge. I told myself I'd stop, that I'd satisfied my curiosity. But deep down, I knew I wasn't done. There was too much left unanswered, and I couldn't ignore the possibility that the astronaut's secret was just the beginning of something far more unsettling. I thought I could leave it alone after what happened with Mark, but a few days later, something pulled me right back in. While scrolling through a science forum, I found a post from someone claiming to have worked in video editing for a government contractor. Normally, I'd ignore stuff like that, but this one caught my eye. This person mentioned reviewing footage from NASA missions that was never meant to be public. They didn't post the footage itself, just a description. They talked about hours of boring spacewalk recordings, except for a handful of clips labeled classified review only. According to them, one of these clips showed a shimmering object moving near the ISS, eerily similar to what the astronaut described. They said it didn't act like space debris or any known natural phenomenon. It seemed to change direction and speed, almost as if it was aware of its surroundings. I decided to reach out to this person. The forum allowed private messages, so I sent them a carefully worded question, asking if they had any more details. I didn't expect a reply, but they got back to me within an hour. They didn't reveal much, just that they believed the object was part of a larger classified investigation into extraterrestrial phenomena. They also mentioned something about field distortion, a term I'd never heard before, but they didn't explain what it meant. What struck me most was their tone. They weren't trying to scare me or sell some conspiracy theory. They seemed genuinely conflicted about what they had seen. They said they didn't know if the object was extraterrestrial, some experimental tech, or something else entirely. What they did know was that it didn't belong there. After our brief chat, their account vanished. Username, posts, messages, all gone, like they never existed. It was frustrating, but also seriously creepy. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just some random person making things up. I spent the next few days looking into field distortion and found a few scattered references in old research papers. The concept was linked to experimental propulsion systems and theories about bending space to travel faster than light. It was all theoretical, of course, but the connection to the anomaly couldn't be ignored. If the object really was messing with field distortion, it might explain why NASA and the government were so secretive about it. This wasn't just about UFOs. It could be about cutting-edge technology, or even something beyond human understanding. What bothered me most was the lack of any public acknowledgement. The idea that astronauts might be encountering these anomalies on routine missions, and that these encounters were being swept under the rug, was hard to accept. It wasn't just about curiosity anymore. It felt like a deliberate effort to hide something that could change how we view our place in the universe. I kept digging, but I was careful. I wasn't trying to hack into government servers or anything. I just wanted to understand what was happening. The more I learned, the more I realized how little we know about what's really out there. Space is vast, and we've barely scratched the surface. The idea that something, or someone, might be watching us from the shadows was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. That night, I found myself staring up at the sky, wondering how much of what we see is really all there is. The stars seemed different somehow, not threatening, but less distant than before. For the first time, I started to wonder if the anomaly wasn't just a random event. What if it was a message? And if so, who or what was sending it? I had reached a point where it felt like the pieces of this puzzle were scattered everywhere, just out of reach. The astronaut's story, the classified documents, the electromagnetic readings, the cryptic messages, it all felt connected, yet nothing was conclusive. I decided to step back and reevaluate everything. What I found was troubling in its simplicity. No matter where I looked, the answers seemed deliberately hidden. The pattern wasn't just about the anomalies themselves, it was about the silence surrounding them. Then something clicked. While reviewing my notes, I remembered something the astronaut had mentioned in his original post, how the anomaly moved, not like debris, but as though it had awareness. I couldn't shake the idea that its behavior wasn't random. If it was intelligent, even in a way we couldn't understand, what did that mean? I started looking into debriefing procedures after space missions, particularly those involving unusual events. What I found was unsettling. NASA has a standard protocol for dealing with unexpected situations, including detailed psychological evaluations for astronauts who report anomalies. But in the few instances I could find, those evaluations always ended with the same conclusion: natural phenomena or human error. It was as if anything outside those explanations wasn't even considered. It wasn't that the anomalies weren't real, it was that they didn't fit into the framework NASA was willing to acknowledge. I thought back to the scientist's advice, answers that lead to more questions. He was right. Even as I connected more dots, the picture only became murkier. What stood out most was the idea that the anomalies might not be isolated incidents. If they were part of a larger pattern, what was the purpose? Were they observing us, testing us, or simply coexisting in a way we couldn't comprehend? I found myself returning to the electromagnetic readings. Something about them felt pivotal, like they held a clue I was missing. After hours of digging, I stumbled upon a theory from a physicist who had studied unexplained phenomena in space. He suggested that certain electromagnetic patterns could act as signals, not like radio waves, but as a form of communication so advanced it might appear random to us. It was a stretch, but it made me wonder, what if the anomalies weren't just moving with purpose? What if they were trying to communicate? I thought about the shimmering object the astronaut described, how it reflected light that wasn't there. What if that wasn't just a visual effect, but part of a larger message? A way of saying, we're here. And if so, why was it being ignored or dismissed? The more I considered it, the more it felt like humanity might not be ready for the answer. Maybe the silence wasn't about suppression, but about protection from truths we weren't prepared to face. In the end, I didn't uncover any definitive proof. The astronaut's post disappeared, the scientist never responded to my follow-up questions, and the retired astronaut who contacted me seemed to vanish. But even without solid evidence, I knew one thing for certain: the anomalies were real. And whether they were natural, technological, or something else entirely, they reminded me of how small we are in the grand scheme of the universe. Looking up at the stars now feels different. It's not fear, or even awe. It's the realization that we're only beginning to understand what's out there. The anomalies might never be fully explained, but they're a reminder that the universe is far more complex and mysterious than we give it credit for. Somewhere in the depths of space, those shimmering objects might still be out there, watching, waiting, or simply existing in a way we can't yet comprehend. And maybe, just maybe, that's the way it's meant to be for now. I've been with the Bureau for almost a decade now, and let me tell you, most of my cases involve the usual stuff: fraud, some internet shenanigans, the occasional drug bust. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I'd be sent to investigate something like this. My assignment was simple enough, at least on paper: check out reports of weird activity at an abandoned NASA facility tucked away in the middle of nowhere, Alabama. I figured it'd be a piece of cake. A couple of vandals, some local kids messing around, and I'd be back at my desk before the sun went down. Easy peasy. The place was officially called the Armstrong Research Complex, and it had been shut down since the mid-80s. It was one of those Cold War relics, either too expensive to keep running or just plain irrelevant once the Apollo missions wrapped up. Supposedly, they stripped it clean, shipped out all the valuable equipment, and left it to gather dust. But lately, folks living nearby had been reporting strange lights at night and the faint hum of machinery, the kind that seemed a little too high-tech for a building that should have been deader than a doornail. I rolled in late afternoon. The drive out there was straight up eerie. Pine trees lining the road for miles, the only sounds being my engine and the occasional gust of wind rustling through the branches. When the facility finally came into view, it was like something out of a creepy old movie. Cold, imposing, and totally out of place. The main building was this massive concrete block, windows grimy and covered with vines. At first glance, it looked as deserted as everyone said. The gate was rusted shut, but someone had clearly cut the chain recently. I parked my car and walked up to the entrance, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The main doors were slightly ajar, creaking as I pushed them open. The inside smelled like mildew and old paper. Dust covered everything, and the air was thick with that kind of silence that makes you feel like you're disturbing something just by breathing. The front lobby was exactly what you'd expect: faded NASA posters, busted chairs, and a reception desk with a computer that probably ran on punch cards. I started my sweep, room by room. Most were empty or filled with junk: overturned desks, file cabinets, boxes of outdated equipment. But as I got deeper into the building, things started to get weird. For one, there were areas that looked way too clean. A hallway that had been swept recently, a door with a brand new padlock, a light fixture that actually worked. It didn't make sense. If this place was abandoned, who was taking care of it? My curiosity went into overdrive when I found these markings on the walls. Not graffiti, but intricate patterns, almost like blueprints, drawn with what looked like chalk. They all seemed to converge towards one section of the building. I followed them to a door at the end of a long, dimly lit corridor. The door itself was heavy steel, no handle, just a keypad embedded in the wall beside it. This wasn't your average storage closet. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to keep this place locked up. I checked the keypad, half expecting it to be dead, but when I pressed a key, the screen lit up. Input code, it said. Now, I wasn't about to start punching in random numbers. I called my supervisor, explained the situation, and he gave me the green light to try and get in, but warned me to be careful. Here's the kicker, the door wasn't locked. I didn't need a code. As I stood there, debating my next move, the keypad beeped, and the door slid open with a hiss. Inside, it was like stepping into another dimension. The room was spotless, brightly lit, and humming with the quiet energy of high-tech equipment. Rows of monitors lined the walls, each displaying streams of data that looked like alien hieroglyphics. And in the center of the room was a desk with a single computer, its screen showing a live video feed of stars. I should have been relieved to find someone else in this creepy abandoned building, but this was almost worse. The level of secrecy, the sophisticated tech, it felt wrong. I approached the desk cautiously, noticing the chair was still warm, like someone had been sitting there just moments ago. Before I could get a closer look, a voice crackled through a hidden speaker. "Agent Miller," it said, calm and deliberate, "we've been expecting you." I froze. The voice didn't sound threatening, but the fact that they knew I was there sent chills down my spine. "Please don't be alarmed," the voice continued. "You've found the hidden mission control. This facility has remained operational since 1969. We've been in contact with other entities, beyond Earth." I stared at the speaker, my mind reeling. Was this some elaborate prank? Or had I just stumbled onto something I was never meant to see? "You're free to leave," the voice added, "but if you stay, we'll show you the truth." And just like that, the line went dead. The room, however, seemed to come alive. The monitors flickered, displaying a series of images, blueprints, spacecraft designs, and handwritten notes in a language I couldn't recognize. My gut told me to get out of there, but something about the way they'd said the truth made it impossible to turn away. I reached for my phone to take pictures, but it was dead. Not just turned off, but completely drained, like the battery had been sucked dry. Whatever was happening here, it was way above my pay grade. And yet, I couldn't help but stay. For a moment, I just stood there, mesmerized by the monitors as they cycled through images and streams of data. It was overwhelming, not because of the complexity of what I was seeing, but because every detail hinted at something so far outside the realm of what I thought was possible. The calm voice returned. "Agent Miller, before you proceed, there are things you must understand. The work being conducted here has been classified for decades, not to conceal wrongdoing, but to prevent widespread panic. You're standing in a facility tasked with one mission: communication." "Communication with whom?" I asked, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. The nearest monitor flickered, and a series of images appeared. They weren't photographs, but something more abstract: sketches, diagrams, and symbols that seemed to represent something living. The voice didn't respond immediately, and for a moment I wondered if whoever, or whatever, it was had decided to leave me in suspense. Finally, it said, "We call them the observers." We've been exchanging signals with them since the height of the Cold War. They are not from this earth. I wanted to laugh, to dismiss the idea outright, but the sheer weight of the environment around me made that impossible. Whoever was speaking wasn't joking. They weren't even trying to convince me. They were stating it as fact, the way someone might tell you it's raining outside. How is this possible? I asked, taking a step closer to the main console. Why hasn't anyone said anything? There's no easy way to explain, the voice replied, but imagine if the entire world suddenly learned that we are not alone. The implications for religion, for politics, for society itself would be catastrophic. Keeping this quiet isn't just about secrecy, it's about stability. I didn't respond. Instead, I focused on the largest monitor, which displayed what looked like a massive antenna array. The image zoomed out to reveal a diagram of Earth and the Moon, with lines connecting the array to a distant point far beyond the solar system. Below it was a single word, Andromeda. I felt my stomach twist, not in fear, but in the realization that I was standing in the middle of something that defied everything I thought I knew. My training hadn't prepared me for this. Why tell me any of this? I finally asked. I'm not some high-ranking official. I'm just here to investigate reports of unusual activity. The voice finished for me. Yes, we are aware. And you're correct, this was not planned. However, your presence here provides us with an opportunity. You're an outsider. You can bring a perspective that those of us within the program may have lost. I wanted to protest, to remind them that I wasn't part of any program, but before I could, the door behind me slid shut with a quiet hiss. It wasn't threatening, but it was clear that leaving wasn't an option, at least not until they were ready to let me go. Let me show you something, the voice continued. One of the monitors switched to what appeared to be a live feed. It showed a room filled with glowing panels and instruments, manned by figures wearing uniforms that looked modern but unfamiliar. They were focused, exchanging words I couldn't hear. This is Mission Control, the voice explained. The real one. While the public saw Houston, the true efforts were taking place here. And they still are. The camera panned, revealing a massive screen at the front of the room. It displayed an image of deep space, dotted with stars. At first, it looked like any generic shot from a telescope, but as the view sharpened, I saw something that made me freeze. There was movement, subtle at first, like a faint shimmer, but then more distinct shapes began to emerge. Geometric, almost crystalline, and impossibly large. They weren't natural. They couldn't be. Are those ships? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We don't know, the voice admitted. The observers haven't provided us with detailed explanations. They've only shared pieces of knowledge, technologies that we've adapted for our own purposes. But we've come to understand one thing. They're watching us, just as we're watching them. The room felt colder, or maybe that was just my imagination. I stared at the screen, trying to process what I was seeing. The shapes weren't behaving like anything I'd seen in satellite footage. They moved with purpose, almost as if they were aware of being observed. What do they want? I asked. We don't know, the voice repeated. But we do know this. The observers have been monitoring humanity since long before we had the capability to detect them. And if they've chosen not to interfere, it's likely for reasons we can't comprehend. I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of those words. This wasn't just about aliens or technology. It was about understanding our place in something far larger than ourselves. As I stood there, trying to absorb everything, the voice added one final thing. There's much more to show you, Agent Miller. But before we continue, you must decide, are you willing to learn the truth, knowing you can never unlearn it? The room fell silent again, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The question hung in the air, pressing down on me. Are you willing to learn the truth, knowing you can never unlearn it? It wasn't a casual inquiry. It felt like a contract, the kind that would bind me to something far bigger than myself. I knew I couldn't leave without answers. I'll stay, I said, my voice steady but low. The voice responded almost immediately, as if it had anticipated my answer. Understood. Follow the light. A soft glow appeared on the floor, leading toward another door I hadn't noticed before. It wasn't ominous, just practical, like everything else in this hidden facility. The door slid open as I approached, revealing a corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. The hum of machinery was more pronounced here, and the air carried a faint metallic scent, like it had been filtered too many times. I followed the light, walking past rooms with thick glass windows. Inside, I caught glimpses of equipment that looked both familiar and foreign. One room housed a massive server bank, its lights blinking in synchronized patterns. Another held what looked like a laboratory, with walls covered in charts and equations that made no sense to me. Where are we going? I asked aloud, unsure if the voice would respond. To the archive, it replied. Before we continue, you need to understand the history of this place and the context of what you've seen. The archive turned out to be a large, circular room with walls lined from floor to ceiling with screens and filing cabinets. A single table stood in the center, with a sleek terminal glowing faintly. Please take a seat, Agent Miller, the voice instructed. I sat down, feeling the cool metal of the chair beneath me. The terminal screen flickered to life, displaying what looked like a timeline. The dates ranged from the 1940s to the present day. Scroll through at your own pace, the voice said. I hesitated before swiping my hand across the screen, bringing up the first entry. It detailed the origins of the program, how it had started during World War II as an offshoot of radar research. Back then, scientists had stumbled upon strange signals while developing new communication systems. The signals weren't random, they had structure, patterns that couldn't be explained by natural phenomena. The timeline progressed into the 1950s, when the space race began. It was during this era, the archive explained, that the signals became more frequent and complex. Scientists believed they were being deliberately sent to Earth, and efforts were made to decode them. The public was told about satellites and rockets, but the real focus was on making contact with whoever, or whatever, was out there. As I scrolled further, the entries became more specific. They described the first successful exchange of information in 1962, though the details of what was shared were frustratingly vague. The program had been hidden under layers of bureaucracy, with funding funneled through seemingly mundane projects. One entry stood out: 1969, Apollo 11 and Project Obsidian. The familiar story of the moon landing was there, but alongside it was a parallel narrative. According to the archive, a separate mission had been conducted under the code name Obsidian. While the astronauts were planting flags and taking samples, equipment left behind was used to amplify the signals to a location far beyond the solar system. "What's Project Obsidian?" I asked, half expecting the voice to ignore me. "It was our first attempt at sending a physical message," the voice replied. "The equipment left on the moon acted as a beacon, broadcasting our existence to the observers." I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of that sink in. For decades, humanity had been actively trying to reach out to extraterrestrial life, not just listening, but announcing our presence. Did it work? I asked. "More than we anticipated," the voice said. "Within months, the observers responded in ways we still don't fully understand. They shared knowledge, concepts that reshaped our understanding of physics and engineering. Much of the technology you see today stems from those early exchanges." I thought about the rapid advancements in technology over the last 50 years, smartphones, the internet, GPS. It all seemed to happen so fast, almost as if humanity had taken a massive leap forward. Now I was beginning to understand why. But why keep this secret? I asked. The voice paused before answering, as if choosing its words carefully. "Imagine what would happen if the public knew the truth. Would they focus on the progress we've made, or would they fear the unknown? Would they see the observers as allies, or as a threat? Secrecy isn't ideal, but it has kept us safe." I couldn't argue with that. People were afraid of change, even when it was for the better. The idea of intelligent life beyond Earth, life that was more advanced than us, would shake the foundations of everything we believed in. As I continued exploring the archive, I came across more recent entries. One described a breakthrough in communication, a way to send and receive real-time messages, bypassing the delays caused by the vast distances involved. Another hinted at the possibility of physical contact, though no details were provided. "What about now?" I asked. "Are they still communicating with us?" The voice didn't respond immediately. When it did, there was an edge of caution I hadn't heard before. "Yes, but their messages have changed. They've become more specific." "Specific how?" "They've begun asking questions about us. Our biology, our behavior, our limitations. And most recently, they've expressed interest in something we cannot share: control." A chill ran through me, not from fear, but from the implications. The observers weren't just watching us, they were trying to understand us. And now they wanted something more. The screen in front of me went dark, and the voice spoke again. You've seen enough for now. There's more to discuss, but first you need to understand what's at stake. Are you prepared to continue? I nodded, even though I wasn't sure if I truly was. This wasn't just a story about aliens or secret missions. It was about the choices humanity had made and the consequences we were now facing. The terminal powered down, leaving the room bathed in a soft ambient glow. The silence was heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. I couldn't stop replaying what I'd just seen, the timeline, the revelations about the observers and their latest messages. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to finish. The voice returned, steady as ever. What you've learned so far is just the beginning. There's one more thing you need to see. Step onto the platform. I hesitated. The platform beneath the nexus pulsed with a faint blue light, its surface smooth and unbroken. It didn't look dangerous, but there was an unspoken gravity to the invitation. What happens if I do? I asked. You'll see what we see, the voice said. It's the only way to truly understand. I took a deep breath and stepped onto the platform. The light intensified, and for a moment, everything around me dissolved into a blur of color and sound. When it cleared, I wasn't in the chamber anymore. I was staring at a vast expanse of stars, closer and more vivid than I'd ever imagined. The Nexus had somehow transported my perspective, showing me the universe as the observers saw it. And there, among the stars, was something impossible to ignore. A series of structures, massive and intricate, connected by beams of light that seemed to hum with energy. This is their domain, the voice said, now quieter, almost reverent. This is what they've built, what they've allowed us to glimpse. But it's only a fraction of what they are. I couldn't speak. The structures were mesmerizing, but there was an underlying unease to them. They weren't just buildings or ships, they were alive, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to echo in my very bones. They're waiting, the voice continued. For what? We don't know. But we're part of their plans now, whether we like it or not. The platform's light dimmed, and I was back in the chamber. The Nexus stood silent, as if it hadn't just shown me a glimpse of the impossible. You've seen the truth, the voice said. Now you must decide what to do with it. The weight of that decision settled on me, heavier than anything I'd ever faced. Whatever choice I made next would change everything. Standing on the platform, staring at the Nexus, I realized I was at a crossroads. I'd seen enough to know that humanity was involved in something far greater than itself. The observers weren't just distant beings. We were in a relationship with them, one defined by curiosity, restraint, and a delicate balance of power. The voice returned, measured and calm as always. You've reached the end of what we can show you here. But now we need your input. Do we continue to engage with the observers, or do we consider alternatives? Alternatives? I asked. What kind of alternatives? Disengagement, it said. Severing contact entirely. It's a course of action some believe to be the safest option, though it comes with significant risks. I thought back to the timeline, the technological advancements, and the questions the observers had asked. Severing contact wasn't just about shutting down communication, it would mean cutting off the very foundation of decades of progress. It could also mean provoking beings we didn't fully understand. What happens if we disengage? I asked. The room was silent for a long moment. Then the voice spoke, softer now. We don't know. The observers have made it clear they value the connection, but they've also implied they could continue their observations without our cooperation. What that means, we can't say. It was a gamble, and I wasn't a gambler by nature. Everything about this place, the secrecy, the technology, the decisions made in shadow, was built on the idea that the risks outweighed the rewards of transparency. But was that still true? Are we protecting humanity, or were we making ourselves more vulnerable by hiding? What happens if I say no? I asked, wanting to understand my own agency in this. What if I decide this shouldn't continue? You have no obligation to make that decision, the voice said. But your perspective will influence how we proceed. We brought you here because you represent the outside world, those who haven't been consumed by the program. Your judgment carries weight. I stepped off the platform, grounding myself. I don't think I can answer that, I admitted. I'm just one person. This is bigger than me. That's precisely why you're here, the voice replied. We've spent decades making decisions in isolation, but isolation breeds mistakes. Your role is not to decide for us, but to remind us of what's at stake. The words sank in, and I realized the gravity of my presence here. I wasn't meant to be a decision maker. I was meant to be a mirror, reflecting what this meant for humanity as a whole. The monitors around me shifted, displaying Earth from space. The continents glowed faintly, outlined by the soft curve of the planet's atmosphere. Overlaid on the image were faint markers, points of light scattered across the globe. What are those? I asked. Relay points, the voice said. Facilities like this one, hidden across the world. Each one plays a role in maintaining contact with the observers. Together, they form a network that allows for uninterrupted communication. It was staggering to think about. This wasn't just a single operation, it was a global effort, one that had persisted for generations. And yet, most people on Earth had no idea it existed. What do you want from me now? I asked, turning back toward the console. Your report, the voice said simply. You'll leave here with no evidence of what you've seen. No photos, no documents, just your memory. What you choose to do with it is up to you. But we ask only one thing, consider the consequences of revealing the truth. The door behind me slid open, signaling the end of my time here. I hesitated, looking back at the Nexus one last time. The platform, the glowing consoles, the incomprehensible technology, it all felt so distant now, like a dream I wasn't sure I wanted to wake from. Will I hear from you again? I asked. The voice didn't answer. Instead, the monitors went dark, one by one, until the room was left in muted silence. Taking that as my cue, I stepped through the door and retraced my path through the facility. The corridors felt emptier now, the faint hum of machinery quieter, as if the place itself was retreating into the shadows. When I finally stepped outside, the evening sky greeted me with a vast stretch of stars. They seemed brighter than usual, their light sharper against the darkness. I stood there for a moment, looking up and wondering if the observers were watching from one of those points of light. The thought didn't scare me, it humbled me. The drive home was uneventful, but my mind wasn't. I couldn't shake the weight of what I'd seen. The choice to reveal the truth or keep it hidden wasn't just mine, it was humanity's. But for now, the truth remained where it always had, buried beneath layers of secrecy, waiting for the right moment to surface. If that moment ever came, I hoped we'd be ready.